Mr. Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And a very warm welcome to our CERRE's Path to Net Zero Summit. My name is Christina Hansen and I am the Head of Communications at the Center on Regulation in Europe. It's a pleasure to see you here in person at the BIP Meeting Center, and a special welcome to everybody joining us online. I will lead you through today's summit, which is now in its second year, and I want to express a special welcome to the Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander de Croo, our panelists, and our CERRE academics who have come to Brussels for this event. It's an honor to have you here. I would also like to excuse our founder and executive chairman, Bruno Liebherberg, who very much regrets not being able to join us here today. Today is a particularly exciting day for CERRE, as we are launching 3 new publications on the transition to net zero, on renewable energy permitting, and on future gas markets and system flexibility. Each of these reports is available on our website as of today, and you can also access them via the QR codes displayed on the screens. These 3 publications form the backbone of today's discussions, as each represented by the lead authors, followed by in-depth panel discussions. With that, I would now like to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Annika Brack, Energy Director at CERRE. Thank you again for joining us, and I wish you all a productive and inspiring summit. Thank you.
Prime Minister, esteemed members and participants, a warm welcome to CERRE, the Center on Regulation in Europe, and it's in our name. We look at the regulatory framework that underpin the energy transition. Regulation translates energy policy into enforceable rules, ensuring that the public interest is served and consumers protected. To ensure regulation serves and supports rather than hinders, it must evolve with the changing needs of our energy system. I would like to share 3 lessons from our research presented today, and I think before I do that, congratulations are in order because all the authors are sitting here with us today, and congrats on your fantastic work. So first, coordination is critical. Without a holistic approach to the energy transition, we risk imbalances in capacity and infrastructure, imbalances that could significantly raise the cost, the public cost of the energy transition. That's what we're going to discuss in the first panel today. Second, we've achieved a formidable acceleration of permitting procedures during the crisis. But to ensure continued success, we need to make sure that we also have the fitting resources on the ground. So permitting authorities need to have the right staffing. We need to implement digital tools, digitalization, and these are just 2 of many other factors that we will discuss for the renewable permitting in panel 2. And 3, system integration is key. We need a holistic approach and consider the interplay between renewable power and gases to transition Europe in the most cost-effective way to a net zero economy. We must move beyond siloed approaches to system planning and grid management. Easier said than done, for sure. As we discuss these themes, it's essential to consider the context in which the EU Commission will operate and also the European Parliament. And I think it's safe to say that competitiveness of the European industries is a top concern for everyone here. European leaders have been shifting and adapting their thinking. The Green Deal, Europe's growth policy, will be complemented by a European industrial deal. And Prime Minister, you've been an early advocate of this agenda and of this balancing exercise, maybe the early advocate. For sure, you talked about it much earlier, before the bubble here in Brussels started referring to Mario Draghi in every second sentence. So, we're noticing geostrategic competition, and a temptation in the member states to resort to protectionist and industrial policy at the national level. And our researchers have outlined in our flagship publication, Ambitions for Europe in 24-29, how very much it is important that we look at deepening the market rather than resorting to national approaches. There has also been much debate about overregulation in Europe and its temptation to first resort to regulation as a solution. But I just want to remember us that good regulation is an asset. And we have an asset here in Europe. The very fact that we have agreed on European-wide decarbonisation targets is something that creates envy in Americans, for instance. The fact that we can provide long-term certainty for investors, that we can actually put out instruments to help building nascent clean tech markets and help incentivize demand. CERRE has published research earlier this year on how regulation needs to evolve, the dynamic regulation, enabling regulators to learn and adapt along the way to incentivize and facilitate the deployment and the scale of clean tech and low carbon tech. So today, I'm pleased to announce that in line with earlier well-known fora in the digital space that CERRE is running, we're going to launch a forum on the clean industrial deal to accompany the Commission's work on this matter. We're going to bring together our industry members, our regulatory members, and wherever relevant policymakers and other stakeholders to discuss key areas of industrial decarbonization. And this starts with CCS market design. It will include hydrogen offtake. We will discuss electrification. We will discuss load growth from technology. So in many other topics that in a direct or indirect way are very relevant to the competitiveness of our industry. The aim has to be to build a regulatory framework that supports productivity growth and industry competitiveness on the way to net zero, and not just when we're there. Our advantage is to bring together these two sides, regulatory authorities and industry, and in that way we are really looking into the machine room of the energy transition. So anyone interested in this initiative, please do come talk to the team at the sidelines of this summit. Prime Minister, we're most honored to have you here and to support this very important agenda. So I'm thrilled to welcome you to the stage. Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. For a forum on regulation, maybe at some point you may need to make a regulation on lunch breaks and make sure that everyone gets back on time. But really honored to be here to talk on the topic of regulation, and definitely related to energy. Energy, which is a topic which I think 10 years ago would not be at the core of economic policy. Today it is definitely at the core of economic policy for many reasons. One of them being our transition to a net zero society, but also, of course, geopolitically, what has happened over the past years. I think in Europe, in general, we have a tendency to regulate quite well. I think our regulation is of high quality, and in other domains often serves as a standard. If you look at what we have done with GDPR, and I know a lot of people have complained about GDPR, but GDPR is worldwide seen as the standard and is often being adopted as something that is a reference to others. I think the issue is that for something we do quite well, we have a tendency maybe to do it a bit too much. And so we regulate quite well, but we have a tendency to think that this is the only lever that we have in achieving our objectives. Regulation plays a role, but innovation and financing plays a role as well. And so good regulation leaves enough room for innovation and is combined with the right structure for financing. And Annika, you told me to not use Draghi in every sentence. I understand that. Though I am a big fan of him as a person and of the work that he has done. I think if you read the Draghi report, you should always do it in combination with the Letta report, which is the one on the internal market. By accident, we asked 2 Italians to write those reports, but both of them are actually very high quality reports. And the Letta report, of course, creates the environment, the internal market environment, which is not complete yet, to be combined with industrial policy, which is more discussed in Draghi's report. I think that if you want to do good regulation, which is light enough, we should try to figure out what each one is good at. And in principle, you have the public sector being governments setting the regulation, and you have the private sector, which is active in that environment. What are we as public sector good at? We are good at setting objectives, and that's our role. That's what we should do. What we are not good at is, in general, it's figuring out what is technologically the right method to achieve those objectives, what you could call innovation. Governments are historically not good at innovation. That's not our objective, and that's because innovation works with trial and error. Governments are not entitled to do trial and error, though we do some errors from time to time, but it's not in the typical spectrum of innovation. And so the one issue that I see is that in Europe we have a tendency to regulate on the objective, but also to regulate on how to reach the objectives. And that's not the right thing. And so we have a tendency to be much too directive on, and the objective on how to get there. And you can see that across many domains. One of them, for example, is our whole hydrogen strategy, where we are also trying to define which color of hydrogen you can use to reach the objective of net zero. We should not be doing that. We should be very clear on the objectives of emissions. How do you reach there? We should be much more open-minded and have much more belief in innovation, which is something, and we might talk at some point about IRA, where IRA is actually quite good. IRA is very technology neutral, is based on taxation measures, whereas ours, this is an instrument which as European Union we don't have. We have a tendency to try to fix everything in our regulation, and then to add layers to serve any political purpose that we might have. CSRD and the many other packages of regulation that have been created comes in a sphere where sometimes it is reporting for the sake of reporting. And I know some of our Belgian industrials who today, especially in the chemical industry, are recruiting full departments. It's departments of between 50 to 100 people just only to do reporting. Just fill out forms and fill out documents where we could ask a question, what is this really serving to? I mean, what goal are we serving besides a political goal where you can say, well, at least we asked them to report on it. But asking someone to report on something that is never going to be controlled or never really going to be used, you could really ask if we're not just putting too many layers of regulation on. So that's one domain I wanted to touch on, is we regulate quite well, but let's focus ourselves on what we are good at, which is the objective setting, and let's be much more open on how to reach it. That's one element. That's the innovation element. The second element, I talked about innovation and financing, is the financing part. And the financing part, I think, is something which is, we do not put enough emphasis on. We have talked a lot about the lack of a capital markets union in Europe. And I've been finance minister, this is now 7 years ago, and this was the core of the finance minister's discussion. 7 years down the road, it's still the core of the finance minister's discussion, and in any of the reports of Letta and Draghi, you will read what the issue is. And the issue is that in most European markets, you do not have a growth capital market. You have it in Germany, you have it in the United Kingdom, which is not in the Union anymore, and in France you have it. All the other countries, you don't really have a growth capital market. And the reason is, of course, that growth capital today brings money, but also brings a certain degree of expertise. So your funds are siloed into certain industries, Markets like Belgium, the Netherlands, and others are not big enough for that. And often those are the economies that have the highest degree of innovation. If you look throughout Europe, what are the most innovative countries? It's typically the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands and Belgium. These are the powerhouses of innovation and have a true lack of what I would call specialized finance to support it. There's two answers to that. One answer is a lever that public money can play, and I believe that public money has an important role to play. The issue is that on the European level up to now, if we do that, we have to find a compromise between 27 countries, and so we end up with a fund where we give every of the 27 just a bit, and then in the case of Belgium, within Belgium, then we have to give Brussels, Flanders, and Wallonia just a bit, and so it gets really spread out. There is a counterexample to that, and the counterexample is what we did with the EU Chips Act. The EU Chips Act was trying to build again a strategic advantage in semiconductors. And the EU Chips Act is the first time where, for a budget of, I think it's 3 to 4 billion, we did not say we're going to give every 27 a bit, where they really looked merit-based and said, where is the expertise? And the expertise is, I think, with Fraunhofer in Germany, is with Leti in France, and is with IMEC in Belgium. And they allocated purely based on expertise and asked each of these centers, now you go out and try to find partners throughout Europe to make a network. And to me, what we have done with the EU Chips Act really should be an example of what we should be doing with the Industrial Act, which is really looking at expertise and not at political balances. That's one part of the story. The second part of the story, of course, is the EU capital market, which is not there for the moment. It's not that we have a lack of capital. I mean, the European continent is a continent with a lot of capital. The savings rates are still quite high, and each of our inhabitants in general are looking for saving scheme or investment schemes which have a higher return than what they typically would get on a savings account. Now, what is happening today is that a lot of that money which is in pension funds and so on is actually going to the United States, is being invested in typical US private equity funds, who then come with their capital in Europe, buy up our startups, grow those startups, and make a huge value added on it. And very often that innovation that is taking place in Europe, so the growth of it is being financed with our own money, but the margin is going to the US capital managers. And the introduction to market very often happens first in the United States, often today in China, and then only afterwards in Europe. So what we see is a missing connection between Europe as a continent of innovation, which we are much more than we actually say out loud in the public, but the growing of that and the market benefit of that is not happening on our side. That again, we can do with regulation, but with taking away regulation. So one of the reasons why the Capital Market Union is not there is that, for example, our bankruptcy laws are very different country to country. A lot of our financial regulation is quite different country to country. So harmonizing that will be a big part in financing, for example, the green transition. So that's the point that I want to make in this introduction. I think that in the world of today, what we need is agility and being focused. Being focused, this is what we need to do as regulators, what we need to do as governments. Focused in the sense of putting the objectives forward. Agility is innovation and is fueling innovation. And this is something where we as regulators need to step back as much as possible and create an environment where the trial and error of innovation can take place and where the financing for that is present. I think that this whole regulation space is a fascinating one. It's something that we Europeans actually do quite well, but our reaction to the fact that we do it quite well should be, let's do it a bit less instead of doing a bit more. Thank you.
So I would suggest, first of all, thank you very much. I think some of what you said was music in the ears to some of the industry members here for sure, about technological neutrality, about the need for focus and maybe avoiding too much reporting. I would like to follow up with a question and maybe then open questions to the audience as well. I would like to ask you, because when you listen to you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, and when you listen to our American partners speak about energy and clean tech, they are very assertive. They say we need US manned, US built, US fueled clean tech along the whole value chain. They have a very clear picture of where they want to land. Is this where we should go as Europe, in selected sectors at least? And combined with that, how should we position ourselves then towards China? We do have value chains, we do receive a lot of modules from China, also with the pressure from our transatlantic partner to decouple.
Good question. I think first of all on IRA, I think the European reaction to IRA, from my perspective, but this is now almost 2 years ago, was too aggressive. Were there problems with IRA? Yes, there were a few problems which were discriminating towards Europe. But we've been complaining for 15 years that we want the United States on our side of the table on the green transition. Finally, they do. Well, we should welcome them. We shouldn't say, oh, no, we don't agree with what you did. So I think the intent was the right one. Of course, and we shouldn't be surprised of IRA, because manufacturing subsidies is something that the United States have always had. So the perspective of IRA is not that new. It is new because it was very green focused or transition focused, but they've always worked with subsidy schemes on manufacturing. Of course, a part of how the United States looks at it is that they want to remain the biggest economy in the world. And this is part of their reasoning. I think we as Europeans, in our attitude towards China, I don't think we have a perspective of saying we want to be the biggest, we want to remain the biggest economy. That's not, and so that is why I think our relationship to China is something that we as Europeans should define ourselves and not let it defined by the United States. In any case, we have elections in a month in the United States. Whoever wins, it will be more America first. In the case of Mr. Trump, maybe a lot of America first, but even in the case of Kamala Harris, it will be more America first. And our only answer as Europeans should be, let's stand on our own legs. But as a European Union, we have much more to gain with trading with the rest of the world than the United States has. And from the perspective of China, I mean, if you are China, who is your #1 trading partner? It's Southeast Asia. Who's your #2 trading partner? Is the European Union. The United States is only the #3. So from a perspective of how much leverage we have with China, actually we are in a stronger position. Now there's a lot of discussion, especially in the energy field, of how far do we go in believing in free trade and so on. And the example is often given on photovoltaic cells, which we were leading on, and now the whole industry is in China. And do we want the same to happen, for example, in offshore wind and in many other domains? I think we need definitely not decoupling. I think we need to remain trading with China and with the United States. But a more geopolitical perspective, yes, definitely. We definitely need to be much more selective and define certain domains where we want to maintain our strategic independence, but also be clear that in other domains we absolutely have no problem to compete and to let the market play its role. This is a skill which we as Europeans really haven't developed over the past years. We're not really good at that type of industrial policy. When I started as a politician 15 years ago, industrial policy, my first answer was always, there's only one rule, government get out of the way and just let the market do it. that has changed. And so that skill of having a sound industrial policy and a sound view on what technologies are going to be important and which ones could create dependencies is a skill that we urgently need to develop, and which is to the benefit of every member state. But I prefer that we do it at European level than that every country tries to figure it out on its own.
Okay, I hear you. We should be more realistic, but also more assertive in a way without seeking dominance, if I may summarize.
That's a good summary. Yep.
So, mindful of time, I would take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Vera Brenzel, I see you.
Hello, Prime Minister. I have a question. I understand that Belgium has gone through the crisis, the energy crisis, much better than other countries. Your growth...
You should tell that to our voters, but yeah.
Apparently, the growth figures in Belgium were 1.4 or something. All the neighboring countries were at least flat, if not negative. We also understand that German chemistry is keeping Antwerp, but really reducing Ludwigshafen and other sites. What is your secret trick? What do you do better than others?
Well, there's a few things which are purely geography. Is that coastal access is becoming much more important than ever. And so a big part of the German chemical industry has no coastal access. And the Rhine was important, but the level fluctuation of the Rhine is becoming a real problem. And this is, for example, why Ineos is trying to build a cracker in Antwerp. That's because of coastal access. So coastal access is a very important element. And of course, Antwerp is the second biggest chemical cluster after Houston. So there's a big base there. So we can be positive on that. But if you look at it, the last 4 years, we haven't attracted a lot of investment. Neither has any of the European countries. But if you compare it to the rest of the United States, the situation in the chemical industry is one which should really preoccupy us. This is why last year we worked on something which is called the Antwerp Declaration, which lines out what the principles should be of an industrial future in Europe. The new Commission with Ursula von der Leyen made it clear that they want to incorporate that within the next 100 days. We're a big fan of that approach. More in general, our growth figures indeed remained around between 1 and 1.5%, whereas in many of our neighboring countries it was around 0. Why is that? I think there is an element fairly said which is a consumption effect. We are one of the few countries which has automatic indexation. Many of you will complain about it because I guess you have to pay salaries one way or another here in Belgium, and salaries have increased a lot. And of course, when consumption is supported, then that has an impact on your growth. But the combination of location and innovation is a key one, and we have a reputation of being the country of chocolate and beer, and the European Union, but we are a country of innovation, and we don't say that often enough. But we talked about semiconductors. The #1 semiconductor research center in the world is in Leuven. If you look at biotech, there's not many places in Europe where you have such a high concentration. So you are in a place with a very high concentration of innovation, a very open society, which attracts a lot of workers from around Europe, and that consumption effect. So I'm glad you mentioned what you said, but underlying, I'm not going to say that we are scared of what is happening in our industry, but we're very worried of what is happening in our industry, and we're confronted with exactly the same problem as Germany, the Netherlands, and the north of France. And this is one of the issues that I have seen over the past years, is that especially the chemical industry is not well represented on the political forum. When we have a European Council, in the heads of most heads of governments, chemistry is something that is dirty and no one wants. Everyone uses it, of course. So that industry, which is really at the core of almost everything we do, is really not well represented, because there's maybe 4 or 5 countries that know it. Germany knows it well, Belgium knows it, France knows it a bit, Italy, Netherlands, and some others, but it's very, very concentrated. So it lacks a bit of clout. Maybe last element is access to energy. We made the choice to not do the nuclear exit. We were going to do it. We changed it around. This, I think, is the most complicated thing I've ever done in my political career, negotiating with a French company, NG, which publicly had said, we want to stop nuclear, and then tell them that actually they're going to continue nuclear, which is really not an easy thing to do. I've seen that Germany has not made that choice. I would love to see if it is maintained in the next years. I think that countries with our energy structure will need nuclear in any case. Nuclear is not the solution to everything, but I'm convinced that it is a big part of the solution. And keeping our current nuclear assets is, for the next 20 years, the easiest thing to do. I understand what is happening with SMRs and so on. SMRs are small modular, well, you're all energy people, you know what it is. And that's good, but the nuclear industry is especially good in PowerPoint. Their PowerPoints are amazing. But making it happen in practice is always much more complicated. And so I think that the next 20 years, just extending the nuclear assets is the easiest thing to do. 20 years later, the SMR technology might be there. But for the next 20 years, I think we should do everything to just keep it open. This is not a criticism, it's just sharing my experience.
We're not discussing nuclear today, but technological neutrality for sure. And,
yeah, okay.
But thank you for your candid words. And I think you've really left a mark on European politics, also for the term to come. You mentioned the Antwerp Declaration, and you will be missed duly here in Brussels, for sure.
I'm not gone yet. Because in Belgium, it sometimes takes some time before you have a new government, but we'll see.
Thank you very much for coming, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for your insightful and inspiring opening remarks. We are truly honored to have you with us at our Path to Net Zero Summit. You're mobile. We are now ready to begin with our first report presentation titled A Balanced Path to a Net Zero Future, Expansion, Flexibility, Integration and Innovation. The report is co-authored by Professor Niels Henrik van der Veer, CERRE Research Fellow and Professor at the University of Oslo, and by André Covatario, CERRE Research Fellow as well and member of the Energy Policy Group. For this session, Professor van der Veer will present the report. André Covatario will join us later for the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Professor Michael Pollitt, our academic co-director at CERRE and professor at the University of Cambridge. Now, I'd like to hand over the floor to Professor Niels Henrik van der Veer for the presentation.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to do this report, so I'll start with a few thanks. First to my co-author, André, and to the CERRE team, who has supported us through sometimes somewhat difficult periods, but not least our sponsors, GRDF, EI, and Endova, who have I think this is this one CERRE project I've done where we've really interacted a lot with the sponsors and had some very interesting and challenging discussions, which I think improved the end product quite a lot. From the first part of the title, the net zero is not really important in our work here. We take that as given. Path is maybe not so important either. We're sort of assuming we'll get there. The core word in this title is balanced. Could you go back one, please? Am I doing this? Yeah. Is balanced. That what we want is to get there in an orderly, cost-effective, efficient manner. There are lots of decisions to be made along the way, and we want them to be coordinated to make sure that we're moving at the same speed at different levels, and so on and so forth. And in the subtitle, I'm sorry, we sort of highlighted what some of the words that we think are key to think about when you think about a balanced path. There's going to be expansion, huge expansion, in very many areas. Generation capacity, network, infrastructure more generally, new technologies, consumer flexibility, and so on and so forth. Second, we need flexibility. This is living its own life. Maybe that's new technology. Flexibility, we need flexibility at the generation level, at the consumption level, but we also need flexibility at the regulatory side. The various decisions that are going to be made needs to be flexible. And we need integration. We need integration of markets geographically across Europe, but also between different energy sources. And finally, we clearly need innovation. It's very difficult to see how we can get in an orderly fashion to net zero without, if not breakthroughs, at least a lot of innovation in technology in the way we do things. I'm not touching this. I'm standing still. Okay, this is our report. So we first have a discussion of what we mean by imbalances. Then we have had a very interesting interaction with some of the CERRE members, as well as the sponsors and others, to discuss and to interview and to send out questionnaires to have them tell us what do they think, how do they see the challenges, and where are the imbalances and what can we do about them. We've also undertaken a number of case studies of different countries. We've selected these countries and the topics in such a way that we aim to illustrate the points that we're trying to make. On the basis of that, we have a discussion which centers on coordination. Imbalances are really a result of a lack of coordination, so that's sort of central to our study. And we point out that markets are very important, they're sort of coordination devices, but they can't solve all problems, so regulation is important as well. And based on this discussion, we end with our recommendations. Our key findings. Firstly, imbalances are a real risk. That comes out very clearly from our interaction with the practitioners, that they see these imbalances developing, and they see that they will become more serious unless things are done. We also find it in our case studies. We have a number of case studies who point to the difficulties of trying to speed up the transition. Spain is one example where they're running into difficulties of simply processing bureaucratically all the applications for developing new sites. We've seen it in Romania, where there has been a very interesting attempt to introduce or to facilitate presumption at a large scale, but have run into difficulties in local networks and in other ways. We've seen it in the Netherlands, in our Netherlands case study, where one wanted to get rid of traditional gases very quickly. Turned out to be hard, And only when they sort of reverted to a more flexible policy, we can see that there's a way out of the problems. It's also the case that risks seem to be increasing over time. It's quite clear from the practitioners, our surveys, that they see many of the risks, they are the same in the short and the long run, but they tend to be seen as more important over the longer term than in the shorter term. Some risks are also more important than others, and at the last point, second to last point here, I pointed out some of them. Infrastructure in general and networks in particular are seen as a huge challenge and potential for creating imbalances, in particular to allow new generation capacity and flows of energy across within countries and across countries. Also point to incentives, that investors get the right incentives to make sensible decisions, to understand what sensible decisions are, for consumers to adopt new technologies, become flexible, provide flexibility to the market, and obviously technologies. How do we ensure that new technologies are becoming available at the speed that they need? And finally, which we point out in our discussion, that imbalances, as already mentioned, are really an occurrence because of lack of coordination. Because investment in networks are not well coordinated with investment in generation. Investment in new intermittent technologies are not well coordinated with investment in storage, in batteries, in flexibility measures, and so on and so forth. So that leads us to our conclusions or recommendations. I think we have quite a few sensible recommendations, don't we, Andre? And I'm sorry to have to summarize them in just a few points, but let me try. Firstly, we think it's very important to realize the magnitude of the challenge, of the huge investments that are needed to be undertaken here, not only in generation capacity, not only in infrastructure, but also in innovation and new technology. That in itself is very, very important to realize. Secondly, as I said, imbalances are a result of lack of coordination. Markets are coordination devices. We are lucky in Europe to have quite well-functioning markets. The energy crisis a few years back, although we saw prices that we've never seen before, the market essentially delivered what it should do. It ensured that there was enough capacity, energy around. So markets are instrumental. They're good to begin with, but they can be improved. However, markets can't do everything. There's going to be a huge challenge for regulatory authorities, and we pointed to some of the things that we would like to see from our regulators, from our regulatory authorities. That's more easily said than done, but they need to adapt to the changes over time. They need to respond to new challenges, and they need to adapt along the way. We also point to the importance of technology, and as the Prime Minister just emphasized, technology neutrality. We don't know what the right solutions are going to be over the next 15, 20, 25 years. So it's very important to allow the best solutions to come forward, and that means not picking winners, but to allow various alternatives to be available. And finally, this is not really something that neither Andre or I are experts on, but it's quite clear that we can see that the energy transition is facing challenges at the political level, that people be willing to accept the costs, the investments, and so on and so forth. And we're arguing that trying to achieve some sort of a consensus about what is needed, what is required, is going to be very important to reach a balanced path to net zero. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Nils Hendrik. That was a great introduction to this report. I'm going to invite the panelists to come up for our panel session that we're now going to have on this. And I do want to start by saying my own congratulations to Nils Hendrik and Andre, because when I looked at this topic, I thought, how on earth are you going to write a report on this? You know, produce a balanced pathway to net zero in 50 pages. And you have managed to do that using some of the methods that we've made a lot of use of at CERRE. There's some great survey work in there, looking at what people think, especially surveying our members. And there's some excellent case studies from around Europe, looking at what's I did ask Andre, what's going well and what's going badly? It was mostly what was going badly. But that's a good place to start. I also want to add my thanks to our sponsors who are represented on our panel. And I do want to ask our panelists to come up now. Clara Pelletti is the chair of ACER. I'm delighted that she's here to represent regulators and give us a regulatory perspective. Nicola Reggia is the executive director for climate change and energy at CEFEC, which is the European Chemical Industry Council. We heard the Prime Minister talk about the need to hear more from the voices of energy-intensive industry. And Paul Domjan is going to come up, and he's the founder and Chief Policy and Global Affairs Officer at Inoda, which is an energy technology company, and it's great to have a sort of technology perspective on this particular topic. And Andre Covatario, who's a CERRE fellow, is going to come up. Why don't you sit here, Andre? And if we've got any further questions about the report, we're going to refer them to you. So welcome, everyone. As we've discussed, what we're going to do is we're going to give our three panelists to my left 5 minutes just to give you a reaction to the report. And then, Andre, I think you were going to just maybe pick up on one or two things that you wanted to say about the report. Clara.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. This is a very difficult, interesting topic. So how to manage imbalances and how to get rid of imbalances, that's impossible. So I think that we should rephrase the question. How can we reduce the imbalance risk, and how can we manage the residual risk? Because that's something that we know we are going to have. And I want to say that since the start, because somehow we are seeing a tendency to increase planning as if we could decide where we are going at what time and knowing exactly the challenges we are going to find on our way. But this is not the case. So I think the real challenge is to learn how to move under uncertainty and how to best react to the unforeseen from many standpoints. Having said that, so how to reduce risk, how to manage the risk. There are some no-brainers, and you mentioned them in the report, improving price signals, locational price signals, time, intertemporal price signals, improving transparency. And this is very important to remember and to recall, because sometimes we go back and ask ourselves, but do we really want well-functioning short-term markets? Do we really need them? Because prices, you know, I don't like them very much when they go high. So maybe it's better to change the way our short market works. So it's good to recall that markets are a very efficient coordination device, short-term markets. And then we get to the question, is that enough? Of course, I guess in Europe and in all different countries, we would get different answers. My answer is no, that's not enough. We have to do more. From the regulatory perspective, I agree that we need to improve the way we regulate looking forward and managing uncertainty. So, for example, something we need to do better is to consider the risk profile when defining the regulatory framework. And the risk profile is changing. It's not the risk profile we had 5-10 years ago. That was a different type of risk. And of course we have risk in our regulation, and we have learned how to handle part of the risk, but now we are going to face additional risks, and this is why we talk about resilience of our networks and how to assess situations that happen rarely but with big impacts. And so I need to look forward, I need to be adaptive, and then asking myself as regulator, am I going to lose certainty in my ex-ante regulation? Because I've learned first day at school that as a regulator I have to give ex-ante certainty. But giving certainty to the market doesn't require not changing rules. You have to set the framework example. You have to tell people what's going to happen if a new shock arrives. What's going to happen if a new technology comes to the markets. So you have to be clear as much as possible about the overall framework, but you have adjustments for sure. We had it in the past as well. Every 4 years, 5 years, you have the end of the regulatory period, and you can change everything under ex-ante certainty. So we have to make this adaptive framework more clear, and in order to do that, we need to have a clearer definition of roles, I think. I cannot build on total uncertainty about the future. And this is something I think in Europe that we need to improve. We have we had a lot of pancaking of different provisions, giving roles and responsibility to different actors, sometimes just overlapping them or without very good coordination. I'll give you an example. NECPs, regulators do not have a role, none. On network development plans, which are not the NECPs, by the way, and then we have the European, we have the national, but some regulators do not approve national development plans. And keep in mind that national development plans are something different from economic regulation of the service you're regulating. So as you see, this is just an example. I could add other plans that we have on paper, and they are not fully coordinated. And I think this is something is very important to remember. And just one last point about imbalance is that whenever you give the wrong signal to the market, and the market anticipates a possible imbalance in the future, you are going to have a reaction now. You're going to see prices changing now. And this is something we are seeing in gas, for example. So it's important that we are very careful about identifying what happens if we end up in an imbalance. We have to clarify the rules. Yes, I think this is a clear priority and something we've learned in the crisis.
Great, thank you. I'm very delighted that you're picking up on some of the themes that we've covered in some of our reports on adaptive regulation, but we'll come back to some of these reducing imbalances. Nicola, industry perspective on some of these things.
Yes, thanks for the invitation, also for the very good report, very timely, and of course, after having already heard about the chemical industry beforehand, it was a very good introduction from the Prime Minister, so I can only concur on what was mentioned before. I like to read this report also to bring it in the context in which we are operating nowadays. Where the issue of industrial competitiveness, it's at the core of the agenda. following what the Prime Minister was mentioning about the Amber Dialogue, where we were co-organizers, we've been also following up with the Amber Dialogues in which we are discussing many aspects. One of them, we are currently working together with the electricity industry to discuss about industrial electrification. How does it happen when electricity prices are not competitive, at least when it comes to fuel switching? And that is bringing exactly this discussion at the core of what we are trying to address moving forward. Because we are in a situation where the path to net zero future, absolutely not disputed. It's a matter of what kind of tools do we use to get there, and whether the framework in which we are operating it's supporting of that transition. When I put together all these elements, there is an element of cost which are embedded into it. And then, and of course, if electricity prices are too high compared to what we see with our competitors across the world, and are still higher than the pre-crisis levels, with all these investments that needs to keep on top of it, how are we going to pay for these investments? If they're going through the bill, then we are again going to increase the electricity cost, and therefore makes it even more complicated to do that switching. So we need to find a way of smartly integrating all these key elements that are here, because it's indeed we are witnessing a lot of imbalances in the system, and all these imbalances at the end of the day are ending up into additional layers of cost that the system is embedding, and then that we are one way or the other paying for it. And I don't think that the solution for the future is to just try to recuperate what we have in the bag from the past. I'll give you one example. Here the key, at least for me, what we are now working a lot is on the flexibility part. Flexibility was something that industry has been quite sensitive towards flexibility, because we was asked from the demand side to be more flexible, particularly the industry side. And of course, industry has been always very reluctant, because our goal is not to help the system. Our goal is to produce goods. So we need to respond to our customers, and some in the production processes can offer some options, others cannot. That was something which was used in the past to cut consumption at the times of critical systems. And then the market has developed in a way where some actors could do it, others could not do it. But then with the excess of renewable electricity production, then the dynamics are changing. And nowadays, there are many elements that we see in the spot market prices that start questioning a lot of the assumptions that were made in the past. Like, why do I need to sign a PPA, which requires, let's say, a fixed price when at the time it is producing? Well, that's when there is excess of electricity in the system, and then the prices are zero or negative. At that moment, I'm paying a higher price because it's the predefined price. So why should I do it? Is long-term contracts is the solution? Yes or no? Let's discuss. Again, it's a matter of what kind of prices is the market developing. New technologies that create this kind of a buffer solution that enables for more flexibility without having to ramp up and down production according to the weather forecast. So these are all elements that say, okay, how do we integrate all these elements into a framework which needs to be flexible as a regulatory framework, but at the same time needs to accommodate what are the bottlenecks that are in the system. Because infrastructures are not built over time, and what do we do in the meantime? And by the time we are getting there, then how else is the market reacting? And all this, we need to do it very fast because it is also part of the discussion we are having with our, let's say, counterpart from the electricity production. The whole electrification agenda was built under the assumption there will be a growing demand for electricity. And on that basis, you keep on investing, knowing that there will be always someone new that will be there to pick up the additional electricity. And now we have a situation where a lot of industrial sites are closing down, and we are witnessing a destruction of demand. And so how do we try to revert that inertia? Because otherwise the whole business models start changing also on their side. I'll leave it here.
Great, thank you, Nicola. You're raising a lot of important points about prices and the underlying economics of all of this. I should remind everyone, please do be saving up your questions, and anybody who's online, please be putting your questions in the chat because we can pick some of those up. Paul, give us a sort of, is technology going to save us?
Well, it's certainly going to help. You know, before I move into that, look, first I'd like to really congratulate Nils-Henrik and Andre and the CERRE team on a really excellent and I think very thought-provoking piece of work. And it's certainly been a pleasure and a privilege for us to be able to challenge you, as you recognized at the beginning, to form what I think is a real contribution to the debate in Europe. And part of why it's a real contribution to the debate in Europe goes to the question you just asked, Michael, which is, you know, this study really shows that the concern isn't about adequacy of production capacity or adequacy of bulk power. That problem's solved. We can produce lots of renewables. It's about network capacity. It's about flexibility. It's about planning uncertainty, market design. These were all the issues that were raised in the study. And I think, you know, oftentimes when I'm here in the Brussels bubble, I hear more and more about kind of this model of how do we build more renewables without necessarily a realization that that's not actually the problem anymore. Like, we solved that problem. Secondly, I think the study is an excellent contribution because it recognizes that we actually need to deal with imbalances on 3 different time horizons, or perhaps 4 types of imbalances. You know, imbalances among fuel types, short-term imbalances, including very short-term imbalances, the need to balance generation and load in real time to keep the network stable. That's at 50 hertz. The medium-term imbalances, day to night, and then the longer-term Dunkelflaut periods when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow for weeks. And that the technology involved in addressing each of these will be different. And I think in the same way that, you know, over the last decade we've had kind of a fascination and a focus on just building renewables, sometimes there's a risk that today the equivalent is on building storage, and actually different types of technologies, including, but in every case not limited to storage, can address each of those horizons differently. And so I applaud you in breaking out those 3 different horizons. I would argue the one that's probably the least appreciated, but actually the most expensive today for European consumers, is the need to maintain the stable frequency at 50 hertz. You know, as we put in place more and more either nuclear that we can't turn off or renewables that we can't turn on, the second-by-second balancing of the network becomes more and more complicated and expensive. Which brings me to another point that I think Clara made, which is, you know, we have to recognize we're going to have residual risk, and we need to manage that residual risk. And I think one of the things that comes out well kind of in the margins of the report is the fact that we're trading one set of risks for another. You know, the previous system had a significant risk profile, and we saw that risk profile when the war in Ukraine began. You know, I began my life in Brussels not sitting here, but sitting at NATO as the commander's first energy security advisor, and I wasn't focused on net zero at all and had a tremendous risk profile to manage at the time. And I think we need to recognize that we're not, yes, the system will have risks, but it's not as though the system it's replacing didn't. You rightly recognize the need for innovation and new approaches, especially in the area of the grid. You know, it's important, I think, for us to recognize that the technology basket that's required for net zero isn't commercially available today. And if we try to implement the full transition for net zero with our current technology set, we're going to be doing the equivalent of trying to build the modern internet with dial-up modems. You know, there need to be a whole set of new technologies developed. And part of the reason for that is what the Prime Minister recognized earlier. You know, policy defines the problem, But this is the first technology transition in history that's been driven by policy. We look at every previous technology transition, and what's happening with AI is following this playbook perfectly. You've had innovators sitting in a university or a startup or a basement come up with something really unique and different, and policy runs to catch up. In this transition, it's gone the other way around. Policy has said, in order to save ourselves so we can still live on this planet, the planet will be fine without us, but we need to prevent climate change so we can be comfortable here. In order to stop climate change, we need to achieve these specific goals. And the first of those was decarbonizing the power system with renewables. But if the policymaker doesn't have perfect foresight, which of course they don't, that policy-defined goal is necessary but not sufficient. And many of the imbalances that you document come from those areas where there was a policy-defined goal, that goal was necessary, it wasn't sufficient, and there are other aspects now that also need to be addressed. You rightly recognize the importance of technology neutrality to do that. I would argue that you also recognize, and the Prime Minister did in his comments, the importance of good regulation crowding in future innovations. And especially then, given that need for new technologies to come to the fore to deliver the transition. Flexibility is one part of that. The other part of that, and I guess this is the point I'd like to end on, the other part of that is I think Europe has a tremendously compelling offer for innovators based on the size of the market, the standardization of the market, the ability to access more than 400 million consumers with one regulatory framework. It doesn't do a great job of marketing that. So when I'm in the United States explaining as an innovator in energy technology why we're deploying in Europe first, my American counterparts think that I have vegetables growing out of my ears. Because everyone in Europe knows about the IRA. Very few people in the US know what the common market energy could offer them.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, a really important point about this is a transition driven by policy rather than by technology in the first instance. Andre, any quick points about your report that you wanted to highlight?
Thank you, Professor. We've heard so many good points, so good that there's nothing for me left to say, actually. But there is one point, actually, that I want to highlight. And first, I would like to just start thanking Niels Henrik and everyone involved in the project for an amazing job and for a very interesting work that we've done over this year. I think it's important we didn't look that much at the objective of the future, but we did look at the past. So we took a step back and we looked at the previous 5 years, and we did notice progress. And this is something that we've also highlighted in our ambitions paper at CERRE. There was progress made over the last 5 years, and especially over the last 2 years, given the context, there was progress made at EU level. Now, imbalances occur when there's a lack of both planning and I think, and also execution, as we were mentioning, basically, coordination, if you want, planning and coordination. But in times of crisis, there's not that much time for proper planning and proper coordination of actions. And in that sense, this progress that we've made over the last few years is valuable, I think. But to your point on how to decrease or manage, if you want, imbalances, not to eliminate because that would be virtually impossible, but how to manage that. I think at the end of the day, our conclusions point to two dimensions that are also connecting with your point on timeline. It is about mitigation and about adaptation to imbalances, I think. So mitigation is those things that we've talked about for so many years, free markets that are showing the signal, predictable environments, policies and regulation and so on and so forth. But the fun part, I think, is the adaptation on how to adapt to imbalances. And we often, and the Prime Minister has mentioned that, Annika has mentioned that, Niels Henrik has mentioned that oftentimes we tend to overregulate in order to offset an imbalance that we are witnessing, that we are seeing in the markets or seeing in the energy systems. But oftentimes when we see an imbalance happening, that is already creating damages. That is already, is not in the making anymore. It's actually creating a specific damage in the market. So to overcompensate for that, to offset that, we tend to overregulate, and sometimes we do it too much. It's like old radio, you know, that was set on a radio station, but for whatever reason goes off track. And then you try to adjust the dial to go from one place to the other to find, once again, the station, the sweet spot, but then you go from one extreme to the other to the radio noise, to the white noise, right? We tend to do that. We tend to over-regulate some, you know, aspects of our energy system, of the well-functioning of our energy systems, and oftentimes we do create other imbalances that are, you know, once again, difficult to adjust or difficult to, you know, address later on. I think that's one of the points that, you know, would connect the idea of over-regulating and, you know, sometimes not letting the markets, you know, show the way, as we did in 2022, actually, you know, some attempts to over-regulate markets instead of letting, you know, the markets show, you know, or the signals, the market signals to show the pathway forward. Yeah, I'll stop here. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Anybody want to kick off with a question from the panel? If not, I'll have to ask one. Oh, there's one there. Just in the middle. With a microphone. I think Zoe's just getting you on. Just tell us who you are.
All right. Hello, and thanks for the presentation. My name is Andrea Boggi. I'm a consultant for Hanover Communications. The question is, I mean, across the board is, of course, you talked a lot about the failure, or at least the need to cross-correct some of the policy actions. In particular, the issue about different layers of planning that don't really overlap in particular. How do you see a fix to that? Well, we know that the next commission is going to look into the governance of the energy union. Is there something they can do to kind of fix the different overlapping, sometimes contradicting actions by different regulators? And then, of course, the other is what also the Prime Minister De Croo mentioned, it's innovation, how to finance innovation. We know there's a lot of ideas on the table for the next Commission to address, whether it's state aid, reform of the EU budget. How do you see that playing out? Do you have preference options for that? And in case of failure to reform the system to finance innovation, what could be an alternative? Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Clara, so start with you. Overlapping planning problems, how can we solve them? Or do we actually, do we have them?
Yes, we do have overlapping, but in terms, if we look from the regulatory perspective, planning is a sort of ex-ante exercise, and when you actually regulate the economic performance, in my view, still we need to regulate the service, not the planning, because otherwise you end up paying for the wires and not paying for what you really get, and you probably end up building up a barrier or lack of incentives to work on innovative solutions. I think planning is useful because it puts on paper the constraints and helps understanding if I change that, this is going to change, you know, it's just a tool. But it's not the way we should regulate. And we should accept that if I pay for a given level of innovation or quality or a deployment of flexibility, now is the time to put money on the table for the value of what I'm getting, not just checking if the plan was realized, but understanding if what the company did was in line with what we expected and what we need.
Nicola, any industry perspective on planning overlapping jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's a nightmare, not only for that, but also because if you add on top of that also the specialized lawyers who are engaged to block any decision that is taken. So we have situations with planning and the companies go through the whole planning procedures and then you're still not allowed to build, and then you go back to court and back several times. So now we have was mentioned a project in Belgium to build a new chemical site. It's 10 years that they're going back and forth. They don't manage to use it. There was another example in Germany. They've built a pipeline to transport CO2. It's been there for 20 years. They cannot use it. Because every time there is a new challenge, a new idea of how to challenge the pipeline and to do extra. And it's just becoming a nightmare. So if it's also if you pile up the issue with planning on the energy sector, plus also the whole exercise on the demand side, then I'm just wondering at a moment, where are we going? And I know that this, because the typical response is yes, but planning, it's a local level. Sure, but we also managed to do some regulation at the European level during the crisis with renewable energies. We managed to get some speeding. I think there is a moment we also need to understand what do we want out of all this process. Otherwise, we're going to just get stuck in exchanging papers.
Paul, I was going to ask you about the financing question. I mean, is there, you're an entrepreneur in Europe, you're an American. Is there a financing problem? I listened to the Prime Minister, and I thought, is this really what's preventing the energy transition?
Yeah, let's talk about financing for a moment, because I think it's a question that gets asked all the time, and it's a really interesting one. There is plenty of funding for early innovation, grant funding, university funding, whatnot. Like Europe does that well. There is plenty of funding for deployment of technologies once they've received a commercial order. There's a huge gap between early innovation and commercial orders. And part of the reason this gap exists is because our venture capital ecosystem, both in the US and Europe, was built for software. And in software, you can leave the lab and get one customer. And then you get two customers. We produce substations, right? You go from 0 to hundreds, but nobody buys one substation that might work. Whereas they buy one piece of software that might work. It's a much more evolutionary incremental pathway. So you have an ecosystem in venture capital that's all based on early customer adoption. And the energy transition is not going to be driven by early customer adoption. Why is that? It's because fundamentally the energy transition is about electrification. The electrical grid was designed 140 odd years ago, and it's an analog system. It's not software defined. So we need hardware innovation, and hardware innovation has a different funding cycle. Now, what worries me when this question comes up, so we need to bridge that gap, the so-called valley of death, where you're between, like it works in the benchtop to I have a customer. There are probably two ways to do that. One is to try to put public money into that gap. That's very hard to do because, as the Prime Minister rightly pointed out, the public sector isn't very good at picking winners. It's also hard to do because it gets very political. The other option is, how do you get that customer to come forward? And I think that's something that Europe is potentially well suited to do from a regulatory perspective. We're talking about anticipatory investments. We're talking about risk-based regulatory approaches, risk-based decision-making. Can we lower the barriers so that a utility can say, actually, yes, this is something new, but I can try it at a small scale. And that provides that early adoption traffic to draw in the private sector funding. I think we have a tendency in Europe to approach these questions of where can we put public money, as opposed to where can we use good regulation to draw in private capital. And certainly there's the opportunity to do the latter.
Great, thank you. Andre?
Can I just have a quick thought on planning, because in one of our workshops, something very interesting came up. It seems that planning is a bit of a three-dimensional, let's say, process. So first of all, we are talking about two vectors. I mean, to reach net zero, you need some sort of coordination across, electricity and gas. And we've seen that in our case study on Quebec, on dual energy system. So that's one dimension. Then the second dimension is what you were referring previously, the coordination, if you want, between local, regional, and EU-wide jurisdictions. And that is also something that we've seen in the Spanish example on how local limitations may actually spill over to national, let's say, objectives. And then a third dimension is probably all these lenses that we need to have when we look at the objectives for 2050. Social aspects, economic ones, technical ones, environmental ones, and so on and so forth. So planning, or successful planning would need to incorporate all these three dimensions and would need to somehow involve all stakeholders across the board to actually deliver, once again, to coordinate on a less imbalanced, let's say, future.
Yes.
On coordination between electricity and gas and planning, I think this is something at a local level is not discussed much, and is something that the regulator doesn't control directly, which is the electricity demand and gas demand and substitution. But the standard approach up to now has been giving incentives to the single customer to switch, let's say in heating system, switching from gas to electricity, or maybe you can even have 3 systems at once in the same neighborhood, having electricity, gas, and district heating, and the choice is left to the individual. So there is more about a system of incentives than planning. I don't see an integrated plan. I don't see it in many countries in Europe, an integrated planning, and I'm not even sure we could talk about planning. It would be nice to have a planning. I mean, I would like to have a planning, but I don't see it.
In the UK, we've just got a national energy system operator to do integrated planning between electricity and gas. So that might be an idea. Anyone else in the room who wants to ask a question? Otherwise, I've got one online here. It's not an easy one. So how do you strike a balance between effectiveness and efficiency? Anybody want to go? Because I think a lot of this is about that. Yes, we want to promote net zero, but on the other hand, we want to do it at a reasonable cost. So how do we stay on a balanced pathway which trades those things off?
I don't know, but
this was directed to you, Clara.
To me, okay. I don't know, but I can say that if you want to avoid not avoid imbalances, but reduce imbalances, you need redundancy. Redundancy means less efficiency and more cost, probably. So I have a question for everybody. Are we willing to accept some redundancy? Because this is something that is in your report as well, at least this is how I read it. Optionality has a value. But if you want to keep optionality, you need to pay for the option, or keep your gas infrastructures there for longer, or take the risk of over-investing in new infrastructures. So that's a question, is not an answer.
Okay, thank you. Niccolo.
Yeah, no, I don't pretend to have an answer, but at least to have some points to reflect upon. It was also mentioned in the report, among one of the examples. I think Netherlands is a very good example of a network which is full, basically congested, and that's also what our members are experiencing. If you need to ask for a new connection, it says fine, wait for 10 years. And then when we start discussing, okay, but why do I need to wait for so long? And then the network operator say, well, the network is congested, and if you would have told me beforehand that you needed it, then I would have started planning in advance. And of course, how do I know what do I need in 10 years' time? I don't even know if I'm going to be in business in 10 years' time. But primarily from, again, from an end user perspective, where industrial end user, where we have a number of options to go towards net zero. Well, they're all in competition. So do I have infrastructures, yes or no? How much does it cost to go for one vector or the other? How much would it cost in the future? What is the perspective? So there is a lot of uncertainty from the end user side, at least from the industrial side, which is probably different from a residential side, where we have more or less have quite developed infrastructures for at least a couple of fuels to choose from. Now, on top of this dimension, there is something that we need to start thinking of, because yes, we have a problem, but also Prime Minister was mentioning in touching upon, you know, that we're not discussing small modular reactors. But we are looking at that as well as an option, because not so much in terms of new technology to deliver electricity to the system, but actually as a potential on-site energy generation. Now, if that, because that would also help us on the one hand, addressing the issue of network congested and also network grids and costs that are coming together with getting electrons from the grid. At that moment, there's also an issue of redundancy that we need to have on our sides because of the security of production of our goods, which becomes a service for the network. So what we cannot get from the network, we can actually put in the network from the end user point of view. Again, when it's going to happen, I don't know. If I listen to, and yesterday I was chairing this group on nuclear, they talk about after 2030 and moving forward. Today was in the news that Google in the US is developing the first, deploying the first by 2030. One of our members also in the US by 2030, 3.0, will have the first SMR up and running. So maybe something is moving faster than we thought it would be. Just how are these new solutions going to change the landscape in which we are operating? And then maybe the waiting for the infrastructure becomes a different type of waiting, different type of addressing infrastructure. So it's just a matter of how do we put all the pieces, and maybe there are new innovations, innovative solutions that are being developed. What we notice in the market is that the uptake of electric technologies in industry has been quite slow over the past, I would say, 10 years, well, up until 10 years ago, because pretty much there was not big of an interest and the innovation was not going there. Now we see new ideas coming up, which might have an impact on the way we are addressing the energy system in the future. So how do we, let's try also to be flexible also in looking at how new solutions might change the profile of the end users, and maybe the whole issue of planning and flexibility might have a different dimension in a couple of years.
Paul, efficiency versus effectiveness. Because, you know, this is pretty crucial for policymakers, isn't it? I mean, the reason why they delay effectiveness is because they're worried about efficiency.
I think they also have it's about what priors you start with. So let me offer a slight kind of transatlantic perspective on this. You know, the biggest difference in the energy debate in this kind of room when I'm in, last time this was in Las Vegas in the US versus here, which is for the Edison Electric Conference, not for gambling. But the biggest difference in this panel, if we were in the US, would be that everyone would have said load growth 5 times. You know, there's a view in the US that enabling load growth is key to delivering economic growth, and economic growth is part of what we need to do. Whereas we don't have that same attitude. If we look at the Netherlands, you know, part of what is the Netherlands' problem? It can't accommodate any load growth. You know, it adopted a policy around electrification of heat that would inevitably lead to tremendous load growth and didn't adopt a policy around anticipatory investment to support that load growth. So there's a level at which we need to make some decisions about how much priority are we going to give to load growth and to enabling load growth through innovation. You know, from an innovator's perspective, you know, what we try to do is offer the technology choice to push that efficiency for effectiveness frontier out, and then allow regulators and utilities to make a different set of choices. You know, today we're having a debate about how do we incentivize the flexibility on the load side by encouraging energy users to adjust their behavior. You know, we have a suite of technologies that enable that load adjustment to happen at the network level with voltage control without involving or changing the conditions of supply for the user. So now we don't need to pay the user because they're still receiving the same quality of power they did before. You know, innovation is going to enable us to deliver flexibility in ways that are much less painful and disruptive, and therefore complicated to roll out for the user than we have today. I mean, if I think back 20 years ago when I started, you know, had the first people come into my office to talk about the flexibility benefits of smart meters, you know, we thought that we would have dispatchable loads distributed across residential households by the 2010s. And we're still not there. And I don't think we're going to get there because the coordination problem is so large. So let's think about other ways to solve this problem and enable dispatchability, but not necessarily dispatchability that requires significant change in behavior from the user or significant replacement of the capital stock.
Great. I mean, great point about load growth. Having just come back from China, everything is easier if demand is growing at 8% a year. If it's not, you've got a problem because every pound you spend, every euro you spend appears directly on somebody's bill per unit. Andre?
I hate to continue referring to our previous work at CERRE, but it goes back to regulation, I think, and planning, right? So is what we've touched upon in our previous report on what the role of regulation ought to be in the next few decades to facilitate, not hinder, actually, the energy transition, one that is orderly, just, inclusive, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, regulation would need to learn from the past, from previous experiences, would need to respond to current, let's say, challenges, and then look forward and anticipate as much as possible this uncertainty, and by doing so to strike that balance in between, you know, effectiveness and being efficient. At the end of the day, I think it goes back to regulation and planning, or this is just a way to dodge the question, or, you know, but I think it goes back to regulation. Yeah.
Okay, great question over here. Get a microphone. Thanks, sorry.
Clemens Schuster, and the question of also what I want to pick up on financing innovation, and what you now brought in. Looking, for example, at how solar panels on private houses or on houses are distributed, I think in Europe we're going to see quite an obvious thing. The norther you get, the more solar panels are on the roofs, and the more south, the lesser. And especially maybe for economic reasons, but Germany, Austria, they have that since 20 years, 30 years, even innovators did that earlier. What everyone is lacking, that more or less each country does all of that by itself. So they do all of the production, import, distribution, and then of course we have the network question fully unsolved, kind of how the grid will balance the loads, all of that stuff. And just looking from my very private journey, being native Austrian, living in Switzerland, Germany, now in Belgium, and always we had this type of solar panels on our roofs. There are always different models how to acquire them, how to run them, how to get them reimbursed, how to fuel the networks, all of that. I think that is actually a very easy question for regulation. And if anyone has this kind of awkward idea of thinking of a European Union to regulate this question, I'd fully support it, actually. And if we have that type of regulation security, there is no question that investments will follow, because then it's a very, very easy thing to know if, let's say, your regulation, if you build anything new or if you renovate anything, then let's say if there's a mandate to add some kind of solar or any other renewables, then it's kind of an easy thing to implement it, but that's fully lacking, and that's fully lacking all of the 27 states and also on the higher level.
Okay, great.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, Paul, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, let me talk about solar for a second. I know this isn't exactly your question, but it kind of begs another question. So when I was studying political science, you know, many, many years ago, we used to say that politics trumps economics. But what I've learned in the energy sector is that physics trumps politics. So you observe the fact that, you know, as you go further north, you have more solar.
I had this conversation recently with, I won't say which, a significant Southern European utility, and they said that makes perfect sense because further north they can afford to pay their customers to melt their transformers because the physics of the system don't enable that solar power to flow upstream. And this isn't a minor issue. You know, it's led to the lifespan of transformers in Northern Europe falling from an average of 35 to 40 to 15 to 20. It's a huge damage to the capital cost stock. So I think it goes to one of the points we've been discussing here on integrated planning. You know, putting solar mandates is a great idea if we in parallel make the grid investments to let that power flow back upstream, and in parallel we make the planning, the long-term planning investments to figure out how to balance it. What too often has happened is these individual pieces happen in isolation. So we get a feed-in tariff in Spain that leads to substations being overloaded. It leads to a bit of a political kerfuffle over not being willing, over utilities no longer offering permits, because we didn't do the integrated planning to begin with of what are all the pieces that need to move to enable this rooftop solar at scale. So I think it really goes back to the same planning issue of, you know, let's be realistic about the physics of how the system works. Let's think about what we want to achieve. Let's look at an option and then cascade through what are all the consequences of that, you know, and what are the technology innovations we need so that the policymaker can draw new boxes. For example, I need a bidirectional distribution substation in order to bring those technologies to the fore.
Great. I think we'll stop with the question. I'm going to give each of the panelists 1 minute to say a positive example of where you think, you know, there's been some good policy changes towards rebalancing for net zero and something that you would like to see happen sooner rather than later in terms of rebalancing. So positive and a negative about getting the balance better. Clara, do you want to go first?
Sure. That's not easy. I think the positive that I'm seeing is that we've been able in Europe to write network codes in a coordinated way. Network codes are rules that are directly applied at national level. I don't know of any other jurisdictions in the world where this has been done. So that was so challenging, and I'm proud that we made it. We made mistakes. Well, for sure we can improve, but that was something. Something that I think we can take as an example not to follow is the provision on energy sharing that is in the electricity market design, where there is a provision asking all member states to allow for physical energy sharing among consumers, small and bigger, and that to me doesn't make sense. It's like not being consistent with the market design that we all have in mind.
Great, thank you. Two brilliant ones. Nicola. Positive and negative on balance.
Okay, I think on the positive side, I think we have seen now a rebalancing, first of all, in the narrative. Up until now was the highest energy prices, the highest was incentive to change behavior. Now I think we are getting to the point where we need to find different ways of looking at energy prices in what we want to achieve. And to, especially if we talk about electrification, we need to make sure that this is affordable. And in this respect, we are really now coming to some realism about what are the tools that the current regulation allows to use and how do we start making the best out of those. I'm focusing particularly on flexibility. There is a lot also in terms of integration and planning. We really need to be now serious about what is already in regulation and implementing much more thoroughly. Negative side, I'll say we've been focusing too much on target setting, multiple target setting, and this has led to a lot of lack of follow-up, particularly looking at the grids and how do we integrate the markets together. This has been really left behind, and if there is one thing we need to recuperate is exactly to look at how do we transition in a new system, what are the lessons learned, and how do we readapt? So far we've been too much looking backwards, and I think we also need to look forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, positive and negative examples of balance.
Clara stole my positive, so I've had to quickly think of another one. I was going to talk about the network code for demand response and that process continuing. So my positive will be 2019-944 and the introduction of a framework across the European Union for aggregation. Dispatchability, load management is going to be a huge part of flexibility, and I don't know of another part of the world that has really committed at this kind of scale to creating a framework to aggregate load and dispatch it. In terms of the part that I'm concerned about, it's that I worry and I mentioned it earlier, I think we're putting too much emphasis on storage and not enough on resolving on what storage can do, and we're making a non-technology agnostic choice that has the risk both of dramatically increasing the cost of electricity because we end up using lithium ion as a storage solution that can do everything from frequency to diurnal shifting, but probably isn't the best at any of those, and actually also hindering our transport transition by putting our batteries into the grid rather than into vehicles. Whereas we really need to ask ourselves, how do we maintain frequency stability? How do we maintain balance across the day? How do we deal with periods of low renewable generation? And treat those as really technology agnostic questions.
Andre, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question because you've written a whole report on this. Yes. Two interesting things you were particularly interested by as you wrote the report.
That's difficult. So I think one of the conclusions that we kind of had is that when it comes to addressing these imbalances, we should start with the quick fixes, as we've mentioned here, some of the quick fixes that we've mentioned here, but at the same time also start with things that take longer. Because grid issues, for instance, grid deployment, grid regulation will not happen overnight. So in order to avoid other imbalances that would become at some point, short-term imbalances, we need to also start with the things that take longer, not only with the quick fixes. And in the end, maybe one point that I would emphasize, going back to my first point, is to be gentle with the radio dial on how to adapt to imbalances.
That's a good point. Don't over-rebalance.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. Perhaps everybody can join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful set of comments, and thank you for all your questions. Christina?
Thank you. Thank you to our respected panelists as well as to our CERRE academics for their valuable contributions to today's discussions. A special thanks to Michael Pollitt for expertly moderating this session. So welcome back, everyone. Next, we'll turn our attention to the critical infrastructure and energy generation needed for the transition. We are pleased to present the report Speeding Up Renewable Energy Permitting in Europe, Overcoming Implementation Challenges, authored by Professor Catherine Banet, CERRE Academic Co-Director and Professor at the University of Oslo, and by Professor Filippo Donati from the University of Florence, who is joining us online. Following the presentation, we'll have a panel discussion moderated by Annika Brack, CERRE's Director of Energy, Mobility and Sustainability. Now, without further ado, I'll hand the floor to Professor Catherine Banet and Professor Filippo Donati to share their insights on this important report. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Christina, for the introduction, and hi everybody, both online and in the room. It's my pleasure to present this freshly published report, since it was published this morning, that we have been working on, and I would like as well to extend my thanks to the sponsor of this report, Terna, and a special thanks as well to the Danish Energy Agency for all the good inputs we got from you. We highly appreciated, among other as well partners that we have discussed with. The report takes as a starting point the situation of lengthy, complex, and multiple parallel permitting procedures for renewable energy generation, but as well grid connection and related reinforcement of a transmission grid that have been identified for a long time already as a major barrier to the further development of renewable energy. It delays target achievement, but it also increases project costs. And this contrasts very much with the need to increase the share of renewable energy sources in the system. To address this remaining shortcoming of the energy transition, the European Commission has been initiated a series of legislative and policy initiatives, and some of them have resulted in new legislation, notably the revision of the freshly revised Renewable Energy Directive, so RED 3, as well the revision of the 10E regulation and the implementation of new provision through the Repower EU plan from 2022 into the electricity market design reform. And we also had from before emergency regulation from December 2022 that also included speeding up provisions. There have also been some soft law initiatives and quite a few around notably the European Wind Power Action Plan, also pointing out the need to speed up permitting on onshore and offshore wind. In May 2024, the European Commission updated its guidances on good practices to speed up permitting granting procedures for renewables, the designation of renewables acceleration areas alongside a recommendation on auction design. And by the end of this year, the European Commission will publish the results of the assessment of the implementation of the permitting provisions in the 10E regulation. And we have to mention that, I'm sorry, Annika, the Draghi report identifies the reduction of permitting delays for all new clean energy projects as a key instrument to attain both decarbonisation and competitiveness in Europe. The CERRE report that we are presenting today provides first a mapping of all these new key provisions that are defined in European legislation and that aim to accelerate permit granting procedures. We have a full list, but just to name a few, they concentrate on the development of manual of procedures for permitting granting procedures, the planning and mapping of areas, identification of renewables, acceleration areas, special status for the renewable energy project, opening for prioritization, time limit for permit granting procedures, simplification of permitting, including the simplification of environmental impact assessment requirements, digitalization of permitting, capacity and skilling of authorities, accessibility of permitting authorities with even more one-stop shop approach, and judicial review and alternative dispute settlement procedures. So the report aims to contribute to the current discussion on the manner to accelerate and simplify renewable energy permit granting procedures by taking stock of all these new legislation and new requirements and the policy initiative that came as well at the same time or later, but also identifying key implementation challenges. And that's really the contribution we want to make, is looking at, based on this mapping, what are the implementation challenges and how to overcome them. Because we had very many new requirements that have been defined, and now the member states are in the phase of implementation. The recent infringement package that was published in October showed that only Denmark managed to notify the implementation, the transposition measures for the directive, so we have quite many member states that are still working on that. And therefore, the report focuses on implementation factors of success within the existing legal framework, so not proposing yet another legislation, but focusing on how to implement this best possible. And it analyzes the constitutive building blocks from planning to judicial review such effort must be based on. We identify a series of implementation challenges that needs to be addressed. And we have a series of 7 implementation challenges that we list in the report. And just to identify these implementation challenges is in itself already an outcome, we would say. The first one, and we can come back to the content later on, but it's first the definition of permitting granting procedures and a clear scope of what is the start and the end of a permit granting procedure. It could be actually very difficult to have a clear understanding of where does it start and when does it end. And it is a complex task in practice for both the authorities and the project developer with varying national permitting regimes to be covered under these provisions. And the revised Renewable Energy Directive refers to as the permit granting procedures all relevant administrative procedures. So this could be very extensive, and the report stresses the challenges in defining this exact scope for the procedures at national level. And an important additional criteria introduced in RED 3 is the relation to the start of the permitting granting procedure and the acknowledgement of the completeness of the permit application by relevant authorities as an important moment. And this leaves, therefore, discretion to the competent authority for determining when an application is complete and put as well pressure on the project developer to make sure that the application is complete as soon as possible. The second implementation challenge relates to the interplay between planning and permitting that can't be mutually supportive and be better coordinated in order to solve some of the issues such as coexistence or local opposition very early on. The third implementation challenge relates to parallel but interlinked permitting procedures. There are many different procedures, and not only on generation side, but as well connection side, that are relevant for the life cycle of project development in order to make it come to practice. The fourth challenge relates to the differences in repartition of competences for permit granting among national authorities. Could be many different authorities, including municipalities, involved in such processes, and just from the top-down approach, imposing some deadlines or some procedures could be a real challenge. The fifth implementation challenge relates to prioritization of renewable energy projects over other projects, and this is including for judicial review, dispute settlement procedures, and appeals. The sixth implementation challenge relates to the need for balancing exemption regime and safeguards. As I mentioned, some of the requirements relate to exemptions provided to some of the requirements such as environmental impact assessment or consultation procedures, but we reach here a point where we need also to have safeguards towards certain exemptions, notably environmental protection or safety standards. When providing exemptions, additional guarantees to both project developers and competent permitting authorities should also be provided to ensure legal certainty for both the project developers but as well the authorities. The seventh and last implementation challenge relates to the balance between common and technology project-specific rules. Indeed, we have some general rules applicable to all the projects, but we have many specific rules, deadlines, or permitting procedures that have been inserted into the legislation, and this could challenge a level playing field between technologies, but as well between countries in the implementation. So the list of identified implementation challenges reveals the dynamic, but as well the remaining tensions between attempts to harmonize permitting procedures at EU level and the remaining specificities of national permitting procedures that often rely on very different and intertwined permitting procedures at the national level. We also, in the report, include several case studies. We have one in-depth case study that has been performed by Professor Donati, and we also have some other more simplified case studies and mapping. We do stress the particular use of national best practices and sometimes bad practices in the face of implementation. This is something that we know very well for environmental legislation implementation. But here we see that because of all the challenges I have mapped, we also need to rely on best practices to improve implementation. So this is the case here, and to support the conclusions, we have an in-depth case study on Italy and a more general overview of some trends in other countries. It also includes specific sections that look at the implementation of acceleration permitting procedures in other technologies, because we see that this is a trend in other sectors and technologies. For example, the floating storage and regasification units connected to LNG terminals and transmission networks, or in the Netherlands and Germany, there have also been, in addition to Italy, such speed-up procedures for FSRUs and for new nuclear reactors in France, notably. So, Filippo, do you want to say a word about the Italian case study?
Thank you, Catherine. Just a few words. You have said enough. Just to say that the part dedicated to Italy tries to analyze how the European Union measures aimed at accelerating permitting procedures have been implemented. And we have found many obstacles, many challenges. The main one is due to the landscape protection decision of local authorities that tend to block any project of a certain size due to its unaesthetic features, and this creates a lot of problems. We have also underlined how the legislator has tried to overcome those obstacles and put Italy finally in line with the European Union requirements. So the big challenges that Catherine has highlighted remain in Italy, but I would say that our report underlines that the legislator is trying to overcome those obstacles.
Thank you, Filippo. So we hope that the report, by bringing awareness around implementation challenges, will support both public authorities and project developers in their effort to comply with the new requirements in order to see this project realized in concrete. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for your presentation. I would like to invite our panelists to the stage. So we have Vera Brenze from TenneT. Vera is the Director of Public Affairs and Communications at TenneT, and you've worked with the Commission, you've worked with Eurelectric, with a big energy utility, so I think you're bringing a wealth of experience here to the stage. Then I'd like to invite Enrico Maria Carlini, the Director for Grid Planning, Interconnections and Permitting at Terna. You're an electrical engineer by training, and you've also have lots of years of grid planning to bring here to this panel. So this is fantastic. Martha Norkjelsen, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, please join us on the panel. Very proud to have the best in class here on the panel today. As we heard, Denmark is the only one that hasn't been told off by the Commission for not implementing RED and the like. And Paula Rey Garcia, welcome to the panel. You're representing the European Commission as the Deputy Head of Unit for Renewables and Energy System Integration Policy at DG ENA. Welcome, everybody, to this panel. I would like to start out by asking you your reactions to the report, your reactions to the key implementation challenges that Catherine has presented, and perhaps starting with the two practitioners here on the panel and then moving on to the public sector.
Thank you, Annika, and well, hello everybody. Yes, I thought the 7 points were spot on. And I like to put that into a little bit, of a graph, First of all, it is super important that we think of where do we want to go. And especially in Germany and the Netherlands, we believe in a target grid. So basically, what would a net zero grid look like? I think we also got it echoed in the Draghi report again, that, he claims, well, you should enhance infrastructure because that is the basis of competitiveness, no electricity, no industry, no jobs, no growth, no investments. So we believe in that, which means that we are obviously planning huge amounts of investments, but it also gives us the opportunity of standardizing, etc. And the report picks it up, coming back to the report, picks it up, we need some sort of standardization also for the supplier market. So the vertical standardization is, let's get planning, permitting, those, basically those processes aligned. Basically from the European Union to the federal level, I just look at federal level in Germany or in the Netherlands, and then down to the province level or to the Länder level in Germany, and then just, one size fits all. It is easier also to train people. It is easier for OEMs to produce and to test things. And then the second level is the horizontal. Get one understanding of what permitting is across the EU's 27. So, for example, I think a hamster is a hamster in Germany as well as it's a hamster in Italy. The population might be affected differently, but it is super important that we get that straight. And I think you pointed out very well in the report.
Thank you. Thank you. So my perspective about the report summarizes very well the ongoing activities that Terna is in Italy to meet the European target and national target. So the main findings of the report resonate strongly with the Terna effort and also with the Italian regulatory framework, especially in light of a revision of the Renewable Energy Directive and the emergency regulation measure. The report emphasizes very well the complexity of the permitting procedure and also the delay in the renewable power plant deployment. So this is an example also in Italy. This mirrors the challenges that Terna in Italy is handling in the new request of connection to the national grid. We have a huge amount of request connection to the national grid. Some things has been done in the past, has been progressively improved. In fact, you can see some number about the new power plant, new renewable power plants in operation in the last 3 years. We see that the trend will increase a lot. For instance, in the 2022, we put in operation 3 gigawatt of the new RES plant, solar and wind. In 2023, around 6 gigawatt of the new plant. This year, we should close to the 7-8 gigawatt of new power plant. So the trend sounds good. And if we increase a little bit this trend, and we maintain this trend for the next 6 years, we are able to reach the European and the national target in the electricity sector in 2030. So this is an important step. Another important things of the report is the emphasis on the technological innovation and digital tool. So the report promotes the digital platform to streamline and to increase transparency in the permitting processes. This is an example of Terna. We launched this year in June a new digital platform called Terra that have the goal to monitor and the grid project and the authorization processes. So this is in line with the transparency that also the report emphasizes. Last point, very important for us, also emphasized in the report, is the stakeholder engagement and stakeholder involvement in the early stage of the planning process. What we say in Italy is the participatory planning. So we launched this process a lot of years ago to involve regional authorities, local communities, cities in general, in the early stage of the planning phase, to reduce the criticalities, to reduce the local opposition, and also to facilitate a smoother project approval. So these are these main three things in the report that is quite in line with what we are doing in Italy in the transmission sector. Thank you.
Thank you. You already touched on topics that we might pick up again in the discussion on the participation element. Martha, I realize I didn't really explain who you are. So you're head of division at the Danish Energy Agency, the Center for Green Electricity, and you actually have the mission to help quadrupling renewable projects on the ground in onshore, I think, in Denmark. So no easy task.
No, yeah, that was our government's goal for 2030, is a quadrupling of wind and solar onshore. And it's also our division that's implementing the RED III. And I think the key findings of this study resonated very well with us. So, of course, initially we were a little bit disappointed that there wasn't a big grand solution we hadn't seen, that the problems that we face are very similar for all of us. So I wanted to give our perspective on like two things that takes up quite a lot of room with us right now. We are knee-deep in the implementation of the RED III. And I think one perspective of it that makes it difficult, it's always difficult when implementing EU regulations, is that it takes a centralized approach in planning for renewables. In Denmark, we have a very decentralized onshore planning. So we have to figure out how the logic of the RED III fits into our system. And that poses like, it's difficult at some points, but we can see also, we can see the idea, but we have to make it fit the Danish system. And that also like leads me to the next actual very practical problem we see in Denmark, is that we don't have enough people that know enough to do all these projects. So we need to have people in all municipalities who can deal with quite complicated legal text, environmental law and planning law, and they also have to deal with a lot of interests at stake at the same time. So this requires quite a lot of skill sets, and they are simply not there at the moment for the push that we're seeing. So what we're also trying to do with the implementation here from a government or state view is we really try to make a playbook for them so that it gets as easy as possible, so that it can come out and live very fast. Because like as a lawyer, I know that like it takes 10 years to rub the law into the world, and so we don't have 10 years. So it's a responsibility for us on the state level to really translate what it is the RED III is about. And so that's like an added complexity, I think, and that we need to help as much as we can, because the resources are not there at the moment.
Yeah, thank you to make that point, which we also hear from other regulators across Europe, that they grapple with the reality of implementing the rules that come from Brussels. And I'm sorry, that's not an easy introduction. I would
no
hand over to
problem.
you.
So no, thank you very much, and thanks also for the very interesting report, and for both aspects in it, really the mapping of the provisions that are now in force, but also the identification really of concrete implementation challenges, because as it has been highlighted, really we have now the revised legislation in place, we have really a big increase in ambition, and the big challenge now is, of course, to implement it swiftly and to put it in place. And there are quite some challenges, not only on the resources side, but also on the fact that it touches indeed on different governance levels. So going a bit into the report, I would like to also stop at some of the implementation challenges that were mentioned there, because we think these are quite important. And one is really, as it was highlighted also in the presentation, the definition of the scope and the starting point of the permitting process. This, we think, is quite important, and in fact is something that we clarify in the revised RED, that is really, as it was mentioned also in the introduction, the completeness of the application, what really gets the clock ticking. We also share very much the point and the highlight on the implementation challenges of ensuring the consistency between the planning side and the permitting side. And I think here we have really tried to tackle the bottleneck that we see on permitting with such comprehensive vision, and looking really into how to combine this also with the related deadlines, which is also something that is quite important. So for instance, for the designation of renewable acceleration areas, we come in legislation with shorter and also with more targeted permitting procedures. And we think this is really a step in this direction of more integrated processes, both on the planning and on the permitting side. I think it's also quite important to touch on the prioritization of renewable energy projects. This is something that we see makes really the difference, and where we see that also progress is unequal at member state level. So what we have now in the revised RED on the overriding public interest presumption is quite important, and it's really something that will facilitate that projects meeting the necessary conditions. They also benefit from derogations where relevant of some environmental provisions, and this is really quite important also element in the revised legislation. So overall, I think also it's important to mention that one point that was highlighted in the report, which is the balance between provisions that apply across different technologies, so general permitting rules, and also technology-specific rules is also something that we have in the revised RED and that we consider to be quite important. So we have different rules that take into account, for instance, that for offshore, the lead times are longer, whilst for instance, heat pumps or solar equipment in artificial surfaces, then the deadlines can be shorter, or the procedures can be simpler in the case of repowering as compared to new projects. So also this element of fine-tuning the provisions were relevant to technology specificities, we think is also quite important. Thank you.
Thank you, and maybe I can follow up with a question, because I at first thought I had dreamt it, and I had to actually check again this morning, because I read yesterday in the media that there's a letter from 11 member states and organizations asking for yet another revision of the RED directive and tackling yet another legislative proposal for permitting. What do you think about that? And maybe also, Vera, you could also say something about how TenneT sees the success of the current provisions. Has it brought an acceleration?
I would start with that, maybe. Well, coming to Germany, Germany has, I was mostly hit as a country after the energy crisis, because basically going from, very gas-based to totally renewables and nuclear phase out. So basically there is no choice then really ramping up the new grids. We as TenneT, we really started to use the emergency regulation, and did the permitting based on the emergency regulation. And now we're coming into the situation where we come into a sort of gap that RED 3 or emergency regulation, they're kind of basically cannibalizing each other, and we don't have the implementation of the RED 3. So that is something. But I mean, what does it mean in practice? In practice, it means that we have, I started at TenneT 4 years ago, and they had 120 kilometers roughly planning, building, and in the wake of being realized. Today, we have 3,500 kilometers of being planned in the permitting process or even being built. And the very large DC lines, those who are, supplying the southern part of Germany, where there's lots of industry, but really no, how would I say, no resilient energy, or how would I say that? Steuerbare. So large power stations, we have 2 times 2 gigawatt already being built, Südlink and Südostlink, and that would not have been the case had we not really been able to work closely with the permitting agency. So I cannot really complain for Germany, I must say, but we need that implementation of RED 3. If we don't get that, and the 11 member states letter, I'll leave it to you to explain, to give your view.
Thank you. So from my side, I think that the speeding up the process of the permitting is essential to meet, of course, the European decarbonisation target, but is a sort of trade-off between the public consultation for transparency and speeding up the permitting process, not only for the renewables, of course, for the connection of the renewable to the grid, but also for the reinforcement to the grid. In Italy, we have a situation is most of the renewables are in the south of Italy, is a sort of opposite situation of Germany, with most 80% of the new projects are in the south, but most of the consumption are in the north. So we have not only to connect the renewables to the grid, but we have also to reinforce the grid from the south to the north, from the island to the mainland. So it's important the speeding up the permitting, not only for the renewable, but also for the grid, for the reinforcement of the grid. So what has done now, as mentioned before, we try to improve the situation to give available for everybody a new platform, digital platform, for the stakeholder engagement, but also for the administrative bodies like the ministry, the regional authorities and the local authorities that are in charge of the permitting of the process, to better understand the situation and the status of each project. We mapped in this digital platform all kind of the constraint in the Italian territory. For instance, the environmental constraints, for example, the Natura 2000 sites or special protection zone, or some other kind of constraint like cultural and heritage goods, or area with hydrological risk, agricultural area, industrial area. We map everything on the territory with all the constraints. We insert in this digital platform also the existing grid, also the data, the geospatial data of the new power plant, the renewable power plant, and also how to can evolve the grid in the future with the connection of this new power plant. We think that this digital platform could help everybody to monitor the process, to monitor the status of each project, and the deadline and the timelines of each project, and also the administrative body to a better evaluation in terms of the environmental impact assessment of this project and the impact of each project on the other projects. So this is our experience in Italy.
I think in regards to do we need faster permitting procedures or not, I think that we do. But what we see in Denmark is that it's not the actual permitting procedure that's the big problem. This speaks to the scope of when are you within the deadlines of the directive and when are you not, because what we see is what delays the projects in Denmark is field studies and everything they have to document in order to live up to the environmental law standards. And that poses a very big delay factor in the project, not as much as the time spent on the municipalities or the authorities' table, but more out in the world trying to prove that your project is in accordance with the environmental law, for instance. So for the second question of the 11 countries, I don't know what's in the letter. I haven't heard about it, but I would say it depends on what they want to change, because there will be something that would make a difference for Denmark as a member state, and there are some changes that wouldn't make a difference. So I think it's very like specific to how do you plan in your country and what helps and what doesn't. And we have like, when we look at the barriers in my division, and when the government asks us, what can we do, how can we make this go faster, we always look at, okay, so what's the wiggle room here? And if it's legislation from EU, we know the wiggle room is very small. So we kind of look at, okay, so what national barriers do we have? So, but I think definitely in an European Union context, it would be to take a step into the sphere of environmental law and look at like, so how do you want to balance these two interests? Because where we stand, that's where it hurts at the moment. It's very, very difficult, and it's also what brings the local resistance against the projects, and that's what we see when the local municipalities, they don't want to take in projects, because they're not going to get re-elected if all voters hate it. So it's complex.
Yes, so I think from the Commission side, we cannot emphasize enough that the focus now is very much on implementation, so on really making sure that what has been agreed in the 2030 framework is now put in place, and also supporting member states in this process. And this relates not only to legislation, but also to non-legislative efforts as well. And I would like to name at least a few. So we have put already almost a year ago in place a plan already to support implementation, the so-called Accelerate initiative. And we have been meeting with all 27 member states bilaterally, really to see how best to support in the process of implementation, to listen to the different difficulties like the ones that are being mentioned now, and to see how we can support in that effort. And we have also seen how to, let's say, be more reactive in that regard. So we also have an online tool, question and answers, where member states can really reach out with the different elements that we face when implementing the provisions. We have also come up with different guidance documents and recommendations, including on renewable acceleration areas, on permitting, and we have adopted all those in May last year. We are also setting up and working together with member states in a dedicated expert group, seeing how to implement those recommendations in practice in relation to permitting. So I think we have quite a lot already going on to support implementation. Of course, we need to keep monitoring, it doesn't stop there. So, and we have also other elements in the pipeline, for instance, the guidance on infrastructure permitting that is also part of the action plan on grids. We are also monitoring the different measures that are being put in place as part of member states' efforts, and seeing how they relate to our recommendations as well, where more support would be needed. And of course, if there is a need then for revisiting any of these, of course, that we will examine it when it comes. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, before I monopolize here the follow-up questions, does the audience have any questions? Yes, please. I think there's a microphone on the way.
Hello, and thank you for the input given by the panel so far. My name is Ezgi Kızılocak. I'm from the German Federal Network Agency, and I have a question regarding the interdependencies between the different legal acts that has been introduced on EU level. The report clearly shows that there have been a few legal acts been introduced recently, as far as a revised 10E regulation, for example, or even soft law with the EU Grid Action Plan. And for me, the question arises that not only how do we, on a national level, translate those provisions into national law, but also how can we have a common denominator when it, with the regulations within on EU level. For example, the Grid Action Plan emphasizes the accelerated permitting on new and already existing PCIs, and also the more efficient involvement of stakeholder involvement. And my question is, how can we summarize these with the revised 10E regulation, for example, when the Grid Action Plan says it has to be accelerated? Does it mean that the already strict deadlines within the 10E regulation have to be reconsidered or redefined? How can we harmonize the different provisions from the different legal acts and then translate it into national law? And also the role of the one-stop shops, for example, when it comes to this. So maybe the Commission can give some input on that, or maybe there is a guidance in planning for our role in this, because I'm from the section that is responsible for this area, so it's a personal interest too, so thank you very much.
It almost feels like one of our workshops, actually, when the regulators come together. So I think this goes to you, Paula.
Yes, I think there were
Maybe
some elements possibly for the study as well, if I understood correctly, but for what has to do with EU legislation. So as mentioned, there is guidance in preparation on infrastructure provisions that are part of the RED permitting. And then there is also, in relation to the 10E regulation, a study now being undertaken that will be followed by workshops beginning of next year to look also into implementation of these aspects. So this could be also an opportunity to gather reflections like the ones that you are sharing. Thank you.
But if any, it just shows the huge complexity of the task and the many moving pieces, and that I think implementation is not a clear-cut task to just fulfill. I think it's important we keep this dialogue going across Europe also.
Maybe I could add one point. To be frank, I'm not a lawyer. I could not really answer, because what is which law has primacy? Because climate and nature kind of clash sometimes, but there are two big things that are underlying the underlying changes. So these are really paradigm shifts. The first one is really that you no longer have individual nature on natural, because we have the administrative permitting where there is a lot of change too, but I'm talking about the environmental permitting. I do think what is the big change in the entire acceleration is that you no longer look at the individual animal or nature being affected, but at the population or at something equivalent. That has really had a big impact. And then you change the burden of proof. So far, we went to the permitting and planning process and waited until we had the very last piece of permit. And then obviously, it is who sticks more to the rules, us or the permitters. Today, we start already with the individual permitting elements. That also accelerates. And that goes across the PCIs, that goes across the grid action plans, that goes across the ONDPs. That is the philosophy, I would say. But I'm not a lawyer to answer that. And to come to the other side, which is not the nature side, but more the administrative side, I think that was at least the implementation of the big corridors in Germany. You just have very big highways, like super fast line. So there is no longer a discussion whether it is left of the town or right of the town. There are big corridors, and that is being that was the third very big paradigm shift to get to, you know, a step change in speeding up.
Any further questions? Yes, please.
Hi, again, Andrea Boggi from Hanover Communication. The question in this case relates to the permitting. As the Commission mentioned, they are doing a lot to support member states with guidance documents. I would like to know for the rest of the panel if they think this is enough, considering that implementation has always been an issue, especially on some of the energy policies, with member states up to, as far as I know, until a few months ago, still late on implementing some RED II requirements. So there's going to be still an issue going forward. And also whether or not you see some main gaps that still exist in supporting the faster deployment. We know that even in the Draghi report, faster permitting, even faster permitting is indicated as needed. What can be done in that sense, or if there's some other area that should be addressed beyond financing, of course, which is his own pillar.
What experience in Italy about the permitting of renewables plant? Most of the duration of the permitting of the renewable power plant is due to the environmental impact assessment that limit or lead to the time of the entire process up to 3, 4, 5 years. So this is a big issue. This is a bottleneck, the environmental assessment of the renewable power plant. We have some good example for the reinforcement of the grid. In Italy, we have a law that our plan, our national development plan is subject to the strategic environmental assessment. So we have the national plan and we have the environment report on the plan that detail the impact of the adoption of the plan on the environment. If the plan is authorized with a strategic environmental assessment, the project in the plan are not submitted to the environmental impact assessment. This is a good example how to speed up the process for the reinforcement of the grid. It's not for the renewable power plant. It's an example of the transmission infrastructure, pure transmission infrastructure. I agree that probably with the environmental impact assessment on the project of the related to the renewable could be improved. I don't know in which way, but it's too long, the process now. This is the experience in Italy. I don't know if some other...
Yeah, no, I think we see the same problem. That's where it's difficult to strike the right balance, and so usually it draws out in time, the EIA. I also think that, okay, so we are focused now on permitting for renewables, but I also think, like, at some point we're going to have to talk a lot about hydrogen and infrastructure for that, and because it has to be an offtake, we have to. The quadrupling of renewables in Denmark is not based on the individual consumers' consumption. It's based on hydrogen and the expectation of a different way of selling the energy. Yeah. So we also have to start looking at the broader picture, I think, for permitting. Otherwise, we're going to sit here in 5 years and talk about why hydrogen isn't moving. Or so.
Maybe one thing. I mean, what we see is that we have an economic slump in Europe. I think, especially in Germany. But what we have a sort of disconnection of electrification and economic activity. Electrification is taking place, and this is not only the renewables that need to be connected, and the policy, guidelines, but it is really digitization. So we have a lot of data centers. ChatGPT uses a lot. Bitcoin alone in Europe has the consumption of Portugal. So it's huge and it's massively underestimated. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, well, obviously grid connection is also for storage, hydrogen, as you say, and we see with great grief, what it means if you have congested grids, a huge connection queue, and that the IEA basically comes to that conclusion. But on the other hand, you also have to absorb growth, and we are doubling our exercise per year, and you need the entire supply chain that follows. And I think it is a moment right now where we also think about staggering, basically, pushing some of the lines later because it's just too big and everyone is building. The railway is building, the autobahns are building, and we compete on those markets too. So what does happen? We have a sort of greenflation in that element. So I think we have to take all aspects into account, also the affordability aspect.
Yeah, thank you both for reminding that bigger context. And I think the European elections have provided us with that pause to rethink actually some of the approaches and think about the system overall and hydrogen coming in and the bigger context of load growth, which indeed is a topic Paul pointed out earlier, which is not so much being discussed yet in Europe, but which will come for sure. Perhaps we have a little bit of time left, so I'd love to ask each of you, working on all this, how optimistic are you about our renewable targets with the tools at hand? Will we be able to reach them? And if you were able to make a wish, what would that be? And then I would like to also pass the word to Catherine, maybe a closing word on the panel as well.
I think the 2030 targets are well taken into account by industry, by supply. I do think that, at least in the electrification sector, we also have to think about the non-ETS sectors, and there it gets a bit more complicated. And it's up to the new commission to pick it up with the industries that have a structural issue as well. But I think even if 2040 targets might be very ambitious, I think after a review, maybe a sort of reality check, it is important that we have those targets, because only by backcasting we can do those exercises, like standardizing, like taking best practice, by using economies of scale, and also introducing possibly a different topology. I mean, we're talking about DC, meshed overlay grid, rather than AC point-to-point connection. And these, in the end, can only be implemented if you think big, and then try to reduce it back to your thing. And you can only think big if you have silver bullets or targets or yardsticks, milestones to achieve. But I guess this is going to be decided at a political level. My wish would be that let's keep the 2040 targets, maybe review where it is, where it needs review, but don't lose our goal out of sight.
From my side, I'm quite confident that we can reach the 2030 target in the electricity sector. I don't know in 2040 and probably in 2050. What I see is 4 main bottlenecks. The first one is huge amount of the request of connection. This put a lot of pressure in the administrative bodies to process and to permit them. In the same time, a lot of pressure for the local opposition and the public opposition, local acceptance, because in so many areas we have a high concentration of the new plant. It's not so easy to explain to the local people how to integrate them from the environmental point of view. The third one is the duration of the environmental impact assessment. We have to find a way to reduce them. I don't know how. And the fourth is the last one, is the coordination among the different authorities, because sometimes we have some grant permit from the national level, regional level, local level. We can reduce inefficiency in this way. Thank
you. So I think, so targets is political. like you said, it's a choice of how you want to measure, but it's a change that we have to make in society because of where we're at with climate change and everything. So I don't know if Europe is going to reach its target or not. I don't know enough about it to say anything on that. I think in a Danish context, our numbers look okay. The projections are okay for our national target. But yeah, I think we're going to also have to have a discussion on the whole, like, is it the proper tool to measure? Because do we want to plaster whole Europe in solar? And how do we want to do this? I think it will be a bigger discussion as the closer you get to your targets, then what? Yeah. So, but it's just on my own account. But yeah, it's a.
Yes, no, thank you very much. So I think it's quite clear that member states have quite a lot of homework to do if we are to meet our targets. But what we see and what is really giving reason for optimism is the fact that there is really recognition across all member states on the importance of really addressing this challenge and looking into these bottlenecks that we see for permitting. And I think it's fair to say that it requires quite some effort. There were some references already to the new, let's say, paradigms that we see are now in legislation, and I think one that is really also quite important is the focus now, increased focus on strategic planning, and that is demanding. And at the same time, it's also a big part of the solution because it really helps reconciling environmental protection with renewables deployment and bringing also local communities in. So it's something that is worth the effort, let's say, but of course it's an investment. We also see that this is happening. As I said, we were seeing lots and lots of measures being implemented in our monitoring of what is happening at different levels, not only at the national level, but also more locally and regionally, and how really there are more and more, let's say, good practices coming in also on the permitting side. But of course, as mentioned, this will not stop only with renewable projects. It needs also to look into infrastructure, into grids. So it's part of a, let's say, broader effort to be able to deliver on the targets. So they are broader than what it seems if you go into the details. But as said, we really see that there are positive developments. We see also progress really bringing new numbers on the ground. We see it in Germany also thanks to the use of the permitting regulation, but not only. So we are really very much looking forward to seeing also similar results across other member states. Thank you.
So I hear there's a lot of homework for the member states, but for the Commission also in keeping the targets up. So, Catherine, you have a mic. Perfect.
Yeah, so very quickly, and thanks again for all your comments and input. And the panel shows very well already some challenges or good examples of national implementation. I thought as well it was very striking to see the interaction between the common EU targets and national implementation, this dynamic that we see all the time in terms of EU legislation, that here is we're bringing one aspect of it. How do we go from targets to implementation and fitting that in a national legal tradition or system that is different from country to country. The role of the European Commission, I think, is very interesting to see how you, in this case, supporting implementation. So this is maybe, again, borrowed from environmental implementation, but this is coming now to the energy sphere in different way that probably we have seen before. And also the role of central administration and central government, as you stressed, in also helping in implementation. So that's maybe new administrative practices that we see emerging here. And finally, yes, the value of high targets. Are we meeting the targets? Are we too high targets? Or we should keep high targets, because otherwise we will not. Well, maybe we will be halfway, except in some countries that are doing well. That will be all. Thank you.
Wonderful. And with that, I'd like to just commend you all for your daily work on this very, very big conundrum, which you will solve. So thank you very much.
So, thank you, dear Annika, dear panelists and CERRE academics for your contributions to this important discussion. So, we'll now move on to the presentation of our final report, Europe's Pathways to Net Zero, the Role of Renewable Gases and Flexibility. The report will be presented by Dr. Kong Cheong, CERRE Research Fellow and Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Following the presentation, the discussion will be moderated by our academic co-director, Professor Catherine Banet. And finally, we'll close the day with concluding remarks from the CERRE team, our three panel moderators, Professor Michael Pollitt, Energy Director Annika Brack, and Professor Catherine Banet at 70:55. I look forward to a fruitful discussion ahead. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I know it's our last session. I'd like to be very light on the numbers because, you know, this study is based on the large-scale energy system modeling. We have some limitations, so 5 bullet points per slide and 5 words per bullet point. So it's 25 words each. So I'll try my best not to bother too much with certainly the numbers, but try to bring some of the insights. So the motivation really for this study is to look into the various pathways that Europe can achieve its net zero goal by 2050, and by Europe I mean EU 27 plus United Kingdom, Switzerland and Norway. So that's the focus in terms of geographical coverage in our modeling here. We wanted to understand the role of system flexibility, and in particular on the demand side, how some of the hybrid solutions of the sector coupling technologies like hybrid heat pumps can deliver cost-effectively a pathway towards net zero by 2050. And the second pillar of the study is to look into what it takes to add on the reliability standards, to increase the reliability standards, to hedge against the low periods of wind and solar, but also, you know, taking into account the variability of the energy demand, which is very much in the northern hemisphere, depending on the outside temperature. So we're talking about, you know, the fluctuation of the heat load coinciding with potentially a very low periods of wind and solar energy generation. So what it takes for the energy system as it transitions from today's largely based on fossil fuel system to a more decarbonized in line with the 2050 targets. And that is really pretty much the scope of this study. So we model 3 scenarios. One is just a reference scenario against which we wanted to measure those two benefits. So one is the demand side flexibility benefits, which we call that scenario a flexible scenario. So we allow the sector coupling technology, hybrid heat pumps, to respond to potential system imbalances, so both wind and solar, but also the fluctuation in the potential in the heat load at the residential and commercial level. But also the other scenarios takes into account the reliability, a more stringent reliability standards where we force the model to optimize the system in the way that would allow dispatchable capacity to meet the intermittency, 100% of intermittency. So the potential shortfall between the mean production from wind and solar against the minimum production of those technologies. And that essentially puts on a cost to a potential, you know, the reliability cost to the renewable energy sources, and we wanted to measure. So what is the impacts of having a more reliable system as we progress towards net zero? So some of the key findings here from the so let me just, okay. Some of the key findings are as follows. So what we found is that in the renewables, in the flexible demand scenario, so where the heat pumps, hybrid heat pumps can respond to the system imbalances, we see a much reduction in terms of the capital expenditure, and in particular for the grid capacity, electricity, and potentially hydrogen, so like grid capacity that would be needed. Otherwise, had the system be a little bit less flexible than in the flexibility scenario. We found that the energy prices are much lower in the flexible scenario because, you know, basically what we're doing is that we're allowing the energy, so like demand, to be much more flexible, much more elastic, and therefore responding to potentially imbalances. And that is provided, in our model, that is provided by the hybrid heat pump, sort of responding to those sort of like potential price signals and imbalances at the local level. In the reference scenario, what we've done is we have limited those sort of flexibility by hybrid heat pumps and constraining their mode of operation to more or less to like base load operation. Therefore, trying to mimic in terms of the modeling, to mimic sort of like less flexibility coming from the system. And that is in the reference scenario. And finally, what we also found that, you know, putting more sort of like stringent reliability standard to allow for more dispatchable capacity to meet against the shortfall in the wind and solar might provide more sort of like security of supply, but at rather marginal cost of increase. So we found that the capital expenditure in the more reliable system, where you force the model to have almost 100% of backup of the wind, backup of the shortfall in terms of potential shortfall in wind and solar, will only increase the system's so like capital extension by 2 to 6%. But on the other hand, what we also found out that the prices will largely stay the same in the reliable scenarios. So, and that is provided by two factors. First of all is the flexibility at the local level, because we model in the reliable scenario, we model the hybrid heat pump being very so like flexible. And the second of all is the reserve capacity in the reliable scenario. Those two so like factors allow the model to achieve net zero at the least sort of like cost. And one of the key findings is also actually the energy prices in the reliable scenario is slightly lower than even in the flexible and reference scenarios, by the fact that because we're forcing the model to have a dispatchable capacity, it actually integrates better the renewables, and therefore, because renewables is largely zero marginal cost resources with additional of the reserve capacity, it allows to have a lower prices. But this works in conjunction with when the local grid is enhanced, but also the demand flexibility is provided by the hybrid heat pump. So those are the two conditions that needs to be met in order to have this solution. So these are just the numbers that I've just discussed in terms qualitatively, what we found in terms of the differences in the scenarios in terms of the capital expenditure. I mentioned the impacts of the flexible demand select solutions having one of the lowest cost solution, both in terms of the investment, but also in terms of the energy prices, electricity, and modeled sort of hydrogen prices. I also mentioned the impacts of increasing reliability and what it will have a very sort of marginal impacts on the grid, so like investment, but on the prices as well. So all of this, you can find much more details in the reports with charts and numbers around the modeling and sort of like a lot of detailed assumptions around. We try to calibrate our reference scenarios, but the other scenarios as well, as close as possible to the official European Commission select scenarios. And I'd like to thank the European Commission officials for providing, you know, public select data for us to work with. And with that, we provided a number of like recommendations. Obviously, based on the modeling results, we see that there is a need for local flexibility to promote demand-side flexibility. We model hybrid heat pump as being flexible resources, but there are a number of other solutions how we can achieve flexibility at the local levels. And I'd like to welcome the panelists to discuss some of those sort of like solutions. The modeling is rather sort of like high level. It outlines the potential solutions and sort of like high level cost impacts, but how actually one can achieve the flexibility either on demand side, but also on the supply side, and what policies and regulations are needed. That is something that I really look forward for the contribution from our panelists and speakers in this session. We also mentioned that the local dimensions, obviously, when we do the modeling, it's sort of like high-level modeling, and we think about the flexibility at the sort of like more decentralized level. But when we think that what it in practice entails is is a different sort of story, and therefore we thought that there is a dimension to be discussed around the contribution of the local energy system flexibility, and also the trade-offs between the local solutions provided by the sort of like local flexible solutions, but also the more sort of like transmission and system level flexibility. So those are the sort of like key summaries. I don't want to just to bother too much with a lot of details, and the report is now published, and I'd like to thank CERRE and all of the sponsors and for supporting this study, and yeah, I look forward to really to.
Thank you very much, Kong, and congratulations on the publication of the report. I would like now to call upon the different panelists for this session. First, Claudio Farina, if you can come on stage, who is the Chief Strategy Technology Officer at SNAM. Then Corina, I will sit here. Is it okay? Corina Grajecki, who is Director for European Affairs at ENGIE. Then Frederic Dickmans, who is Secretary General at Gas Distributors for Sustainability. And finally, Bert Savain, who is a team leader of energy economics and modeling at the Directorate General for Energy at the European Commission. So, first, I would like to start with you, Claudio, and for the ones as well, before we start, for the ones online, please send questions. We will be happy to address them in addition to the ones that we will take from the room. So, Claudio, I would like to start with you, and also for thanking SNAM for its historic sponsorship to CERRE, but as well its very active participation to the different reports. This is something that we value very much, also for the quality of the work we're doing at CERRE. So Claudio, I would like first to ask you about your feedback when you've been reading the report, and the same question will go to you afterwards, but let's start with you, Claudio.
So first of all, let me thank you for the invitation of participating here today, and good afternoon to everybody. So it's our pleasure to contribute to such level of studies and such levels of modeling. So congratulations for the report and for the model, which I had the pleasure to read a few hours in advance before it was published. So thanks a lot. So. I think that models and the model and the report have a pretty clear hypothesis, a robust structure and consistent outputs, and also, I would say, clear and useful recommendations. We at SNAM, being system operator, we believe in scenario modeling. That's part of our core activities. SNAM, I think you already know us, but we are the TSO operator, a full unbundled operator in Italy, so pure infrastructure player. Scenarios modeling for us is key in order to set the basis of our network planning and capital allocation, so sort of decisions that have an impact along several decades. So let's say pretty tough pretty tough decisions that have to be made on as much as possible on the basis of facts, data, and evidences. And by the way, since 2019, we started running these national scenarios together with Terna, the electricity TSO, well in advance versus the gas package, and I think with a mutual recognition of the value of having an integrated scenario planning, which I think it's also one of the key features of this model. I think that scenario modeling and, let's say, robust modeling is becoming more and more relevant. Also because transition is, I think, I would say, pretty clear to everybody, will not be linear. So we'll have acceleration, we'll have deceleration. So you need to have scenarios, and you need to have the ability to jump from one scenario to the other one, and not like sort of rigid forecasts. I've noted 4 key, let's say, takeaways from the report. So in synthesis, first of all, I would highlight the crucial role of gases together with electrons. So I think technical neutrality is an absolute value when we have such a big challenge to cope with in such a small amount of time. Second is the value of flexibility, many times stressed also in the presentation before, and I think it's clearly visible in the delta cost of electricity, which swings from one scenario to the other by 6 or 7 times. And that's exactly the value of having set a flexible set of infrastructures instead of a rigid one. Third one is how infrastructure can give flexibility to the system, both at national and international level with interconnections, at an affordable cost, as it is well demonstrated in the report by comparing 2 of the 3 cases. Also because investments in infrastructure spread their cost along a very long time horizon. And final one, the key role of storage, of energy storage, and particularly the fact that we are facing new technologies on the one end, but also very different and new use cases and very different industrial needs, both in terms of duration and in terms of quantity of storage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I would like as well to ask the other members of the panel a quick reaction on the report. Please, Karina.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and congratulations, Kong. It's really a great work, and I'm actually super enthusiastic because I just can agree on everything, and it's really this is really very much in line with our thinking, and this overall view and this view on all vectors is something that is, of course, for ENGIE as being active in all the value chain, so to speak, in energy, in electrons and molecules alike. That is very close to our heart. And if I compare, so our, let's say, priorities or key recommendations that we have established for this new political cycle, it's about cost optimization as being really an integral part of energy policy making. It's through, namely, as you said also, Claudio, technological neutrality, and that with the headquarter in Paris, it doesn't always mean nuclear, but mainly electrons and molecules alike. So that's why the focus on renewable gases is so interesting for us. And then the very strong focus on flexibility is something we totally share. We really believe that it has changed a bit in the past, let's maybe 1 or 2 years, but it was really some sort of blind spot of energy policy making so far. So flexibility and, of course, grid development both need more attention, we think. And that is also what your report clearly highlights. Yeah, so to cut it short, more renewable electrons and molecules, more grids, and more flexibility is actually exactly in line with what we think. yeah, looking forward to discuss a bit more in detail, also on the scenarios and the possible solutions.
Thank you, Corinna. Frédéric?
Thank you. I would like first to thank you, CERRE, for the invitation and to congratulate you, Kong, for this excellent report. Let me introduce my association. It's a quite new association, GD4S, Gas Distributors for Sustainability. We bring together the 10 major gas distribution system operators in Europe. And we are associated because we are committed to decarbonizing gas infrastructure and helping Europe achieving its net zero emission target by 2050. This study, and thank you for that, outlines a clear vision where renewable gases such as biomethane and hydrogen are key to achieving these goals. These gases provide the flexibility needed to complement renewable electricity and decarbonize hard-to-electrify sectors such as industry, transport, and heating also. As gas distributors, system operators, we strongly believe in the importance of the demand-side flexibility. And the perfect example is the development of hybrid heat pumps. These appliances that give the possibility to the consumer to choose between the best of the two worlds. When the electricity is expensive, you can use the gas, and the reverse is also possible. And it ensures efficient use of renewable resources, so it's very interesting. And by leveraging both gas and electricity, hybrid heat pumps improve the overall flexibility and resilience of the energy system, especially during a period of high demand. A great example of sector coupling also is, in practice, is happening, and I give you an example, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. The city is leading the way in combining efforts to decarbonize both gas and electricity networks. In the Westport area, a green hydrogen project uses renewable electricity from wind farms to produce green hydrogen, which is then injected into the gas grid to serve industrial users and help balance the electricity grid. This project demonstrates how integrating hydrogen with existing gas infrastructure can improve the flexibility of the energy system, ensuring a more stable, secure supply of energy. Across Europe, we have a lot of examples. Gas DSO are making significant strides in the energy transition. In France, for example, GRDF is rapidly expanding its biomethane injection capacity, and it aims to reach 20% of renewable gases by 2030. So it's increasing quite rapidly. Meanwhile, in Italy, for example, Italgas is preparing its network for hydrogen blending, ensuring that hydrogen can be safely and efficiently integrated into the existing gas infrastructure. Similarly, in Portugal, Floen is actively adapting its network to the integration of renewable gases also, including hydrogen. These initiatives demonstrate that DSOs across Europe are evolving their gas networks to accommodate renewable gases, offering a cost-effective and reliable solution to decarbonize the energy system while ensuring security of supply. However, as the report clearly highlights, achieving this requires targeted investment and strong policy framework. The European Union has a crucial role in setting ambitious targets, but also in supporting the development of cross-border infrastructure and facilitating the deployment of low-carbon technology. We must collaborate to ensure that renewable gases and demand-side flexibility technologies such as hybrid heat pump play their full role in Europe's energy transition. So I will conclude. Gas distributors fully support the finding of these reports, and thank you for that. By investing in renewable gases and integrating flexible energy system, we can build a sustainable, resilient energy system that supports Europe's net zero goals, while maintaining, and it's important, affordability and security of supply.
Thank you, Frederic. Bert, short feedback on the report and the main conclusions.
Indeed, many thanks for the invitation, first of all, and many thanks for the very interesting report and the presentation. As you all know, we are in a moment of transition in the Commission. The Commission comes to an end. I mean, the first von der Leyen Commission comes to an end. And actually, the planning is being made what we will do in the next Commission. And the mission letters are out there, so all the commissioners designates have their homework to do and know what to plan for and what to think about in the coming years. And when you look at it, you will see, especially in the mission letter of the Energy Commissioner, you will see that all those elements that you recommend are there. Electricity will be the backbone of the future energy system, very much supported by renewables, complemented by nuclear, where nuclear is available, and system integration, including flexibility on producer side and demand side, storage, and connections will be a major part of the work to be done in the future years. All this in order to implement the big package, the big 2030 package that has been decided over the last few years. That brings us to the next point. I heard here cost optimization is an important variable. Technology neutrality is an important one. And then the question comes as well, hydrogen, renewable hydrogen. What's the cost and what can we use it for? And according to our analysis, we think that deep decarbonisation in industry, maritime transport and aviation are probably the first sectors that should be using renewable hydrogen and all its possible derivatives like e-fuels and so on. So thank you.
Thank you very much all for this first round of feedback on the report. We will now go deeper into the content of the report, both in a transversal way, but as well looking at specific topics. And I will start again with you, Claudio, on the topic of energy infrastructure investments. And the model scenarios in the report highlight significant differences in capex and energy prices, depending on the level of the flexibility. That's something that we have already talked about. From the perspective of your organization, what infrastructure investment are most critical for reducing costs, but as well ensuring security of supply in the energy transition?
Let me frame a little bit the answer before getting into the context. So, as you said, the study shows with very good and solid evidence the cost of rigidity. If you take the delta in electricity cost that we saw before, which is 7 times from one scenario to the other, and you multiply times the quantity, and then you multiply time the number of years, you decide what number of years, then you obtain a number which is several order of magnitude greater in terms of cost of rigidity, greater than the cost of infrastructure, which may have solved that rigidity. To draw you another rough example, doing, let's say, back-of-the-envelope calculation, in 2022, because of the gas crisis in Italy, the total cost of energy for the country was sort of 100 billion euro higher than the baseline. And it would have been solved by investing kind of 5 billion of infrastructure. 5 billion of infrastructure divided by 50 years, which is the amortization period of energy infrastructure, is 100 million per year. So 100 billion of year if you don't invest and you have rigidity versus 100 million of cost yearly cost of infrastructure. So that's the sort of magnitude, difference of magnitude in terms of cost of rigidity versus flexibility. When we talk about rigidity, we are not saying that we will be short of energy. We are just saying that we will have a dramatic mismatch between where and when you have availability of energy and where and when you have demand for energy. So in our perspective, three investments are key to solve this sort of mismatch. The first one is storage, in order to shift production in time. The second one is grid and pipelines, in order to shift energy in geography. And the third one is CCS, to have a fast and reliable decarbonisation without, for hard-to-abate industry, without changing the industrial process of the industry sectors where we rely upon.
Thank you very much. We now go back to a more general and transversal issue, that is the one of the choice of scenario, and you have already identified different scenarios, but when it comes to the choice of scenario and energy mix alternatives. According to the treaties, member states retain sovereignty over their choices of energy mix. However, reaching the EU targets that we have been already referring to within climate and energy, and ensuring security of energy supply requires a minimum of coordination on the pathway to follow. And the report identifies different scenarios for the future of the energy mix in order to reach net zero by 2050. Who do you think will or should drive the choice of energy mix and choice between the alternative scenarios in your proper organizations, or from the private sector perspective, but as well from a more EU or member state perspective? So who is making the choice? Who wants to start? Karina?
Thank you. Yeah, I can give it a start. And saying, you're fully right, asking about the level of coordination at European level. And of course, there needs to be a minimum of coordination, be it only to enhance visibility for us as investors on where the direction of travel goes to. And that we have, of course, with the clear 2050 net zero objective enshrined in law, and we have a governance scheme with the national energy and climate plans that could be actually even used more and more evolve into something like investment plans, at least in terms of visibility. However, when it comes to the slippery slope question of the energy mix and who should decide on that one, I don't dare to say anything about changing the treaties. That is maybe sometime in the longer term future necessary. We will see. But of course, as a market player, we think that actually this choice of scenarios and pathways is can be done by the market. You know, with a certain framework, of course. So it's rather about not so much about who drives the choice, but which criteria should be taken into account. And also, that is what we do when we do our own modeling. That's why we are lucky enough to have brilliant colleagues who can do this in-house. And the first thing is, as I said, the clear objective of net zero 2050, so knowing where this has to go. And then, as I said earlier, for us, another clear guidance for any scenario is the cost optimization. That is another element. And then all vectors, all energy vectors, and that is something that we have for our in-house modeling, that we can really use the experience of all the vectors or the whole value chain, and also different geographies, and based on that we come to the points that I mentioned earlier at the beginning, and we really believe that this holistic view is the key to it, and then more immediately, we need to act now towards 2030. Because that is very, very, very soon, and we are not so sure if we will reach the targets. So there's really a question of speed and pragmatism to move forward towards 2050, but first looking at 2030, which is tomorrow.
Thank you. Other comments from Frederic or Bert on that?
Yeah, just to complete, because I agree with you. We think that there is not one size fits all solution, so we need to leave the countries, the member states, and the local to define the best mix locally in function of the geography, in function of the energy landscape. So we believe that it's better to leave the local field to decide to implement the best investment, the best planification. And what we expect from the legislator is to give targets, long-term targets, and to provide stable policy framework. But living, and we know that innovation will come from the private sector, we need to liberate the initiative locally. It's what we think.
Thank you. Bert, please.
Yeah, thank you. I will build up on many of the comments I've just heard. The NECPs are being designed now. I think about half of the countries have submitted, so half have not submitted yet. And that's a very important moment to bring actually everything together and to see where we are in the implementation of the law, on the package, on the big Green Deal legislative package that we have. Important also to see is that we have already started thinking about what comes next. And you will also see again in the mission letters that there is the invitation to think about the climate and energy framework post-2030. And earlier this year, in February this year, we have actually come up with the first 2040 climate target plan that actually set out a first idea of what the energy world could look like in the EU if we have a decarbonisation of 90% by 2040. This is not legislation yet, it's just the first start of what would be needed, what could be a possible world like that. A main conclusion, one of the main conclusions there was actually that we need, and I've heard this here before, that we need all vectors. Everything is needed. We need CCS, but we need CCS for the right things. I also would like to remind you that Professor Draghi said that we should decouple from energy prices influenced by the world events. Yeah? So that means that in a sense, the CCS is then used for cement and maybe not so much for other uses. We also need nuclear, where available. We need hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, for the right purposes. And electricity and renewables are absolutely the backbone of the energy system. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move to the next question that is more, again, on transversal level, but focusing on energy modeling as such, because the report builds on energy modeling tools. Could you shortly elaborate on your company's or institutions' use of energy modeling in the design of corporate strategy or choice of EU policy orientation? So very shortly, how in practice do you work with that? Starting, who wants to start? Claudio?
I can start very quickly. As I said before, this is one of our core activities, and we base on modeling all our, let's say, network planning and resource planning and capital allocation. And as I already said before, key to us has been the possibility to move towards integrated electricity and molecules scenario together with the electricity TSO in our country. That really helped us in having a much better integration, much better coordination, much better understanding each other of the two sides of the same coin.
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, as I mentioned earlier, we also do our own modeling, and unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we are just a bit too early, because we will present our new decarbonisation scenarios next month. But I already told you that, a lot of the things that Kong has in his report will be coming back. So we really have a big team working on these scenarios, and of course with the purpose first of all to quantify, but also to get this across vector and sector view, and of course in our case to make informed business decisions. So that's why it's really an important exercise, but at the same time it never is a prediction of reality. So we think it's important to have certain trends and an order of magnitude, but none of my colleagues would ever pretend, to have this total stability and a 100% certainty that based on those models, every decision will be right. It's just about an order of magnitude.
Yes, just to say that if, of course, we use such modeling system to assess infrastructure needs, investment strategy, and the interplay between renewable gas and electrification.
Bert, of course, modeling is key in the impact assessment of the Commission.
Indeed, so I will take a bit more institutional angle. So all legislative processes in the Commission need to have an ex-ante impact assessment. That's usually a very big document with even bigger annexes. And in the energy and climate field, modeling has been central for probably more than 2 decades. Many of you may know the PRIMES model. Some may be familiar with other models like the potential model and so on. These models typically look to energy mixes, and very much like we've discussed in the previous 2 questions. But we also face that we need to dig into other types of models, especially if we move forward into the decarbonisation. I think if you look to the 90% ambition level, the power sector should be fully decarbonised. At least so on the decarbonisation side, the job is done. For the power sector, there's still a lot of work on other sectors, but for the power sector, there is where we are. So we also should, and apart from that, we are very much in a very difficult implementation phase, as we already discussed. So we are increasingly complementing these models with other tools, looking for short-term modeling, short-term electricity modeling, for grids, for really price formation, for seeing when is gas actually influencing the price of the electricity, for example, is really a big concern now, with the increasing solar and increasing wind, but also complementing it with elements like, okay, how do you decarbonize the land use sector? That's way beyond the audience and the topic of today, but that's also a very big question, obviously.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions from the audience, maybe in the room or on the digital sphere? Yeah, we have one here, please. You can present yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Merve from Rex Energy Certificate Association. I wanted to ask, because when Kong presented, one bullet point there was enhancing market integration. So I wanted to ask, how do you see the union database playing a role into that? So it's a database being developed by the Commission for trades of biomethane and hydrogen.
Karina?
Thanks a lot for the question. I must admit I will probably not have the full expert answer on this. but probably indeed no one has at this stage. Well, we actually think it's extremely important. It's extremely important to have that tool and to get into a real market of the molecules. However, there are a lot of problems of actually establishing this in practice. So this is one of the biggest concerns, aside from the hydrogen framework we will tackle later on probably, that we have, that this Union Beta Days must be feasible in practice. And if we manage those practical questions, then it's a very useful tool and a necessary step towards more market integration.
Thank you. Michael?
Hi, Michael Pollitt, CERRE. Can I ask you for your reflections on the payments problem? Because I think, you know, what Kong's modelling is focusing on is the role of gas in balancing the system and being flexible. The problem with that is, of course, gas customers pay for that. And of course, the gas infrastructure pays for that. And as the number of units of gas distributed declines, of course, the customers pay more for that. And it becomes a sort of capacity market problem, doesn't it? And have you thought about how you deal with that? Because, you know, I think we've got all this, you know, nice modeling of what the sort of system integration benefits are, but there is an allocation of cost problem.
Thank you for the question, Michael. So again, let me frame a little bit my view on this question. So first of all, I will answer thinking about Italy. So the same number may not apply to other countries. But if I think about Italy, first of all, let's remind that as of today, even though gas demand is going down and has gone down in the last couple of years, still gas grids transport every year double of energy than the electricity grid. So it's 600 to 700 terawatts per hour versus 300 terawatts per hour. Having a unit cost in the final customer bill, which is the half. So it's around 3–4% the incidence in the gas bill versus 8–9% in the electricity bill. So double of the energy, half of the unitary cost, just to frame where is the starting point. Then, second point to take into account is that if we do believe, and we do, that we will need molecule and that those gas molecules will flow through our lines, let's say that the gas is naturally hedged versus the risk of deceleration in the take-up and the ramp-up of green gases versus the green gases, because we need to have decarbonization, but as long as no carbon or low carbon hydrogen may accelerate or decelerate, the energy demand will remain for gas, and particularly for decarbonized gas, meaning biomethane or gas decarbonized through CCS. So we see also in very long horizon that our gas grids will remain consistently, let's say, full of gases. And particularly if we think that the calorific value of hydrogen is well below, it's about 1/3 of the calorific value of gas. And so you need to have more hydrogen in order to satisfy the same demand of energy. We're going to present in the next couple of days our transition plan, and several of our analysis around this topic will be very clear and transparent in this document.
Thank you. Let's stay a moment on the molecules and the topic of renewable gases. Of course, as many of you have already stressed, decarbonization of the energy system will entail developing renewable gases. So in your view, what have been the most effective incentives to increase so far development of biogases and biomethane, if we look at really the measures that have been the most effective? And do we need new instruments? So maybe starting with you, Frederic.
Yes, please, thank you. I think the best incentive was the feed-in tariff and the guarantees of origin. And if I take the example, for example, in France, today the GRDF inject, I think, 12 terawatt-hours of biomethane every year with about 700 biomethane plants. It was possible to develop this sector because there was this framework, this regulatory framework. But I know that it's not enough because today they want to increase significantly the injection of biomethane into the gas grid, and they need more support to give the visibility for the investor to invest in a biomethane plant. And the other topic is that they need to be sure that in the future there will be uses for this gas, and it will answer to the previous question. The assumption is that we need flexibility, and gas grids can bring that flexibility. Okay, gas grid today are transporting fossil gas. Okay, we have to get out to phase out the fossil gas. It's possible to develop renewable gases, biomethane and hydrogen mainly. Okay, everything is possible. This grid is affordable, it exists, it works well, but the condition to give the value of this flexibility is that we have to ensure that in the future we will have a certain volume to share the cost of this infrastructure. And this is the key point of this energy transition, is the infrastructure issues. And we are convinced that keeping gas grids operating with renewable gases, it will avoid to over-invest in the electricity reinforcement.
Anyone else who wants to comment on biogases and biomethane? Yes?
Yes, thank you, if I may. I fully agree, of course, with what you said, and I personally find it always very interesting because I'm German and I worked for many years for a German company, and I joined ENGIE only recently, actually. I find it very interesting how far advanced France is regarding biomethane, and how not at all any priority is given to that in Germany. So, well, maybe I'm simplifying too much, but this is the picture I get. So thanks for giving also this example. And indeed, I fully agree with what you said. Everything is possible, and there are really good solutions out there, and there are projects out there. And what helps to get those going and increase their role is targets on the one hand. And we have that. We have targets for biomethane with the 35 BCM by 2030 annually. We have targets for renewable hydrogen, very ambitious targets. But we also need stable and simple regulatory frameworks for that. And of course, we need support schemes. That's why we have the European Hydrogen Bank, because there is a premium for renewable hydrogen, so there is a support needed to kickstart this development. And a major challenge is, of course, that offtake remains difficult, and many of renewable hydrogen projects that have been with our company, but also with others, have been in the making, are on hold, are being delayed, are being cancelled. And that's why we really think now is the time, and Kong, your report only underlines this again, that we need a really sound regulatory framework, and that we need to double check if what we have is realistic, corresponds to the market conditions, and corresponds to where we are, and what is still in the making is pragmatic from the start. I'm referring to the Delegated Act on Renewable Hydrogen, RFNBO, that we already have, that has been discussed very controversially for many years, and where we now see what we unfortunately, as many investors kind of predicted, is that the rules are too strict. Additionality, but especially temporal correlation. I'm sorry I'm getting into technicalities, but those rules are very strict and they make it simply more costly to produce renewable hydrogen. And that is a major hampering element for those projects. And then now, we are just now, this month, in the consultation phase of another important delegated act on low carbon hydrogen. That is actually the missing piece of the puzzle. And there, to be very open, we are very concerned that we actually are confronted with very similar problems, with very strict rules on the one hand, and unclear elements on the other hand, where we are afraid that low carbon hydrogen projects will not fly, or not as many as we would want to see. And this is then again related to renewable hydrogen, because we need those molecules, this market ramp up in volumes, to also trigger infrastructure and then to trigger renewable hydrogen. So we really have to see both of them together, and that is really an element and the time is now, you know, because it's in the making now, so we can do something about it. Bert, looking to you. And I know it's not your unit, but still, in DG Energy.
We are nearing the end of this session, so I will quickly, before we go to the author of the Kong report, ask you to answer very quickly a question, because we need to come back to flexibility and demand and supply side flexibility. Among the 5 recommendations for policy action in the report, 2 points are on flexibility, demand side and supply side. Who will be in charge, in fine, to match the 2? That will be a short round on this, and then we go back to you, Kong. Claudio?
Well, I think we need both sides of the equation, as was effectively shown in the report. Being an infrastructure player, we see more the supply side, flexibility, and I think that all the actors have to play their own role. Companies investing and regulators and policymakers setting the adequate framework.
Karina?
I fully agree. We need both. Demand and supply side flexibility is really extremely important to tackle those, and we need to consider flexibility across all time frames. Not only short-term, but also mid-term and long-term. So not only batteries, not only storage, pump storage, but also thermal plants, hydrogen-ready CCGTs for seasonal flexibility. All of this is needed. It's like the same with all vectors. We need also all forms of flexibility to get to net zero in a cost-efficient way.
Thank you. Frédéric?
No, I confirm it's both sides. We are all on this topic of balancing between gas, the demand side flexibility and the production flexibility. So I would like that the key, one of the key is the digitalization also of the networks, especially, but also of the way you can use the energy, and perhaps also in the way we organize the tariff, the signal that you put in the tariffs.
Thank you. Bert, final words?
I think I will agree that the flexibility is needed. And I will add one element that hasn't been discussed yet. The flexibility is absolutely necessary to keep prices down and for the competitiveness and the affordability. It's a key element to really bring the energy where it is abundant to those places where it is less abundant at every moment of the year, of the day, of every moment in the season. And the flexibility, obviously, is then also on the other side, that people demand the energy when it's cheap or cheaper, so that you really you can get rid of your peaks, because that is really what is making the system much more expensive than it should be.
Thank you all. Kong, some final reflections on the discussion that we have had in the panel?
Thank you so much, all the panelists, for those very interesting comments and the discussion. I think, you know, from this modeling point of view and energy system, we left technology neutrality, because that's what the model is doing. So it's optimizing against the set of costs and constraints of meeting demand, or you select GHG's targets, and then we can simulate the various other scenarios. So what we've heard, I think, is probably the emerging consensus around the flexibility, the system integration. One thing I wanted just to pick out from the conversation that I've heard is the sort of sorry, Annika, for the mentioning Draghi report again on the idea of decoupling of the various markets. I think, you know, we've seen this in this report and many of the other reports. Like, what we've been trying to achieve with all the system modeling is try to come up with the ways to integrate the markets, integrate the vectors to minimize the system cost of meeting the objective of climate neutrality. And we've shown it in this report as well, is that if you do that, you achieve a cost optimal, one of the cost optimal solution. But if you decouple that, you kind of decouple the various markets and put them in the silos. So that works against many of the conversation that we have and the consensus emerging around the flexibility needs in various markets, the flexibility from in electricity and gas markets to try to integrate that. You know, the idea of cross-charging, how do you charge and recover some of the flexibility of the gas market provided to the electricity market, something that Michael just mentioned. That already is a challenge that we are sort of encountering as we try to integrate the system. But now if you imagine that we disintegrate the system, we decouple the renewable system on renewable markets from the power market that is setting prices based on the gas or based on the future hydrogen market, I can only imagine that is one of the worst case scenarios with the highest cost solution, because that's what we showed in the inflexible demand scenarios that we model. It's one of the most expensive solution. We will need to massive investment in one side of the system against the other side of the system. So that's, I just, you know, that's probably one of the points that I wanted just to make.
Thank you, Kong. Very important point, very indeed. We reached the end of this session. Please join me in thanking all the panelists. And I now hand over to you, Annika and Christina.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Thank you so much for your excellent contributions and the audience for staying on so late. First of all, an editorial remark. I'm actually a big fan of the Draghi report, and I think it's a fantastic reading and picks up on so many good points. What I meant was that our keynote speaker, Prime Minister, actually came up much earlier with the industrial side of things and said that, you know, we have to think competitiveness. So that was all I wanted to say about the Draghi report. I didn't want to say that we can't mention other excellent reports than CERRE's reports, but they're obviously also very good. So thanks again to all our academics. I wanted to just take a moment with Catherine and Michael, who are the academic co-directors of the energy practice of CERRE. Perhaps you can just share your key takeaways from the day. Who wants to start?
Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to thank everybody who's contributed today. And I think the one thing that I wanted to highlight was the different approaches that our different reports took, which represents the sort of range of capability that we've got at CERRE. It was very nice to see the balanced path to net zero using combination of case studies and surveys of our members. It was lovely to see Catherine's report on permitting, adopting legal analysis, and we've just witnessed Kong's report, which uses heavy-duty energy modelling to look at price and cost impacts. And I think all of the reports have benefited from stakeholder input, such as we've just witnessed. I don't think any of those reports, and I think the authors did say this, would have been written in quite the way they had if they hadn't enjoyed the feedback from our members and those who participated in the report. So thank you very much to that. And of course, we look forward to doing more work like that.
Two final points on my side. The first one relates to something that we have been hearing almost at each panel, is the question of the pathways and the discussion around the regulation of the pathways, whether it should be or should not, or how be regulated. That's certainly something that we at CERRE are going to work more on that. And the fact that regulatory approach is so key to anything we're doing to achieve targets and decarbonize energy system. That's what we do at CERRE. We are a regulatory think tank, and here we have already some ideas that we are going to work very quickly on in terms of what kind of regulatory approach is needed as part of the forum that is launched today.
And with that, I close the summit. Thank you all very much.